to the Twitter sphere. Hello, hashtag MedEd. Hello, Vimeo. Hello, YouTube. This is the inaugural episode of the FTS podcast, maybe? The hashtag FTS podcast. If you don't know what hashtag FTS is, go to @gatewaymedic@gmail.com. That's @gatewaymedic@gmail.com. And it's @gatewaymedic on Twitter. It's not .com. I don't have a website. But it's a big deal. Finally doing a podcast, really trying to get out that information that's been stored up for so many years. And Nats for docs. I'm not going to change the world with it, right? I'm going to try to raise my own vibrations, right? Try to share my vibrations with the world, and let's see what happens, right? Let's let the universe do the rest. So we're going to pick up my first guest ever. And I'm so appreciative that she's going to be my first guest. She is a change agent. A fired up, passionate woman.
Keep right, then turn right onto Columbia Street.
In the Twitter sphere as well.
In 300
I
meters,
believe that's how
turn
we
right onto Columbia
came across.
Street.
Oh yes, I remember now. Yeah, we came across each other on Twitter sphere. There was, I don't know if I made a wrong turn here.
Continue on to Royal Avenue.
Yes, I did the right turn. So, I think I was tweeting about different things about doing a podcast.
Turn left onto 4th Street.
Oh my gosh, I'm revealing her location. I'm gonna have to mute this. I'm gonna have to mute this. How the hell do I mute this thing? I'll just put down the volume of the GPS, so you guys won't be able to. You'll probably be able to see where I am and figure out where I am, but let's try to keep the guests' privacy somewhat contained. Not that we're gonna do anything crazy or weird on this podcast that'll make you want to attack someone, but the world is a crazy place, and we have to take our precautions, right? So our first guest, let's keep it a surprise until she enters the vehicle. I think most of you probably don't know of her, but gosh, she's a firecracker. Kind of an introvert firecracker. So it's a real blessing, actually, to have the time to have the opportunity to get a little bit into her space, into her world. And she's had some interesting life experiences. Isn't it weird how GPS is always in Canada? They're telling you to do U-turns, and you know full well U-turns are not allowed. You know, when systems set you up to fail, that is an absolutely annoying situation. There should be some type of button on GPS that says, I'm in Canada, this part of Canada where U-turns are not allowed. And then we'd have a lot less stress, risk, people getting pulled over by the RCMP or VPD or Delta BD for doing illegal U-turns. But we're not here talking about traffic law. We're talking about our next guest. Our next guest has had some interesting experiences with healthcare. And that's where I work. I'm a family physician in Surrey, British Columbia. I'm the head of family practice at the hospital where I was born. That's weird, eh? kind of unique. Working at the hospital where you entered into this earthly realm. I guess it's not that common. It also means that maybe I'm not that adventurous, but I have lived in quite a few countries. And I'm back at the best one, the original one. Oh, Canada. There's definitely a lot of freedom here. Just got back from India recently. Wow, what a different experience. I just missed another turn and I'm not able to do a U-turn. So we're gonna make a left turn here. And I'm going to make a left turn here. I cannot go into there. So you can just watch me be a bad driver for a little while. I'm gonna do a U-turn. If you are part of the RCMP, please forgive me. In a parking space, and I'm exiting the parking space. I'm shoulder checking, and here we go. We are back on track. So my energy is actually a little bit low today. I spent the morning at the water slides with the kids and with my good friend Mike and Nicole and Daniel. And then the afternoon was really special. Oh, crud. I feel like I missed the turn again. This, this is not working out the best. Let's see what we can do here. This is a parking lot again. I'll pull in and then pull out. So this vehicle that I'm driving in is actually the vehicle that I bought from Ronda Rousey. Ronda Rousey was an Olympic bronze medalist in 2008 Olympics in judo, and she also went on to become the first female UFC fighter, and she was quite successful there, and she's gone on to success in the WWE. And here, this podcast is being held in her old car. We'll make it there. We're gonna get to the guest. There's a rainbow sidewalk in front of me. I like it. My city is one of the originators of the rainbow sidewalk. A fantastic symbol of liberty, freedom, respect, compassion, general kindness. One honorable, awesome thing to be a part of. To be part of a city that is that welcoming. And that's kind of the culture we're aiming for. We're hoping to get an acceleration of compassion in this culture of ours. That was my dinging. I'm going to probably have to mute all of my WhatsApp stuff. Okay. That's where I was supposed to go. There it is. Yeah, that was weird. I think we found it. I think we're pretty much here. I'm going to pull over and run out and try to figure this out. This is a very steep hill. I'm gonna pull the brakes so we don't all roll away. Oh, Jana, our guest just said we drove by. Let's see what happens on this hill as we reverse it. Oh, pretty good. I did just drive past. Going to end the route. Pull over to the side here. Am I on a one-way street?
You are on a one-way street. I won't tell anyone. Good to see you.
Okay,
About water. If you use Google Maps, it's wrong. It tells you to go like a block past, which is so annoying.
I was just complaining about Google Maps.
So, water for you.
I'm gonna fix my driving. I'm so Asian right now, I'm sorry. Okay.
Wow, that's a setup.
Yeah, so, okay, yeah, so this is the filming, and then this one is the, our viewfinder.
This is the camera?
That is the camera.
Holy doodle.
Just picked it up from Best Buy just now.
That's some serious podcasting. So that's your water?
Check it out, we're on.
Holy cow! We should sing a Lady Gaga song.
Oh, I actually watched that movie.
Did you?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I've watched that movie like
amazing.
6 times.
I saw it on the plane on the way to India. It was
Oh wow.
It was amazing. Oh, okay, there
You're gonna walk around too. And I also have a rice cake for gastric emergencies. 2 apricots for you, because that would not be conducive to. And then these, which are...
You can't eat apricots? Oh,
I don't think apricots would be good.
I know about that. Okay.
With gastritis.
I know about those like real low sugar things, eh?
They're pretty good. And they don't taste like aspartame or even stevia. I know stevia is fine, but...
Thank you so much for joining us. So why don't you introduce yourself to the people? They've been watching us for the past little bit.
Are they recording?
It is. They're on. They're not on live, but
we're just recording.
we're recording.
Okay, here we go.
We started.
We're driving in the night.
We're driving in the
This
night.
is like late night N of 1. Is that what we're calling
That's
it?
right.
Late night N of 1.
That's right. N of 1. We have a physician here, and we have a patient and
A patient and a caregiver.
patient and a
All wrapped
caregiver.
into one.
That's right.
So introduce myself.
Yes. Who are you?
Who am I? Good question at this
fuck are
hour.
you?
And late at night, who am I? My name is Jana Patricia Bielman. I'm 49 years old. I'm the mother of an almost 14-year-old girl. I'm a federal employee. I'm the wife of someone who died. And I am now a patient and caregiver advocate, which still feels a bit like, can I really say that? But I just did.
Yeah. Can I really say that because
it feels
like
maybe like
you?
I don't have quite enough credentials
Oh, whatever.
when I compare myself to the other patient and caregiver.
Oh gosh,
you know what I
there's
mean?
no comparison, eh?
Yeah, it's a bit of an
Everybody-
imposter syndrome,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I guess so. And imposter syndrome is never a useful thing.
No, it's not.
Yeah. If that's what you feel you are, that's what you are.
I think it's just important to say that, right? You know, to acknowledge the... I was thinking about straight roadways, if that makes this late night N of 1 a little easier. And Kingsway is like a straight on till morning.
Sure.
And the number 17 is a straight on till Tawasin.
Does it bother you that pretty much the location of your domicile is pretty much figure-outable on this thing?
In what way?
I don't know. It should be in the background. I'm guessing if anybody knows this area and they are able to see this area, they're like, okay, that's where. Well, I guess it's a good thing that I picked you up from that place in the location that you don't live at. So that's
Okay, we'll go with that. I'm also a bald woman, so I'm not really. I don't do incognito very well.
Okay.
You know, so I'm kind of like, bring it on. Yeah. If they can figure out where I live from the location that I don't live at, then it's all good.
That would be impressive. Now, what is off? What are things that we ought not to talk about today? Is there anything?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, I love that.
And for you?
No, nothing. I'm an open book. I'm at that stage in life where
so am I.
I'm an open book.
You should introduce yourself as the host of this podcast.
I did a little bit on the way here.
Okay.
You know, I had
Introductions are
that
done.
vision that the podcast would be like me driving to pick you up a little bit, and then
Okay.
and so there's like 5 minutes there, and then I did a little bit of an introduction,
Oh,
and then boom, you walked in.
you mapped this.
Kind of fun.
Okay.
But I guess I'll do a little bit more thoroughness. What I do for work is generally I'm a family physician, but I found myself, you know, after going through a lot of burnout in doing family physician stuff in Surrey that I've found myself in a place where I seem to be connecting with a lot of healthcare system leaders, or people who at least self-identify as such, and who are trying to improve our system to make more sense to them, to make their lives and careers feel more rewarding. And a lot of that rests in patients getting better care. So, but everybody's kind of disconnected in that area. And so I find myself kind of doing my best to actually intentionally cross through from different groups to different groups, and I call those groups that don't communicate typically with other groups, and call them silos. And so that's where the hashtag FTS came from.
Which is fabulous.
Yeah, fuck the silos. Let's get together already. Let's keep connecting. Let's not stay apart and just grumble in our own insulated places. Let's actually do something. Talk about issues that matter and try to figure things out.
But you know what's really interesting? There are a lot of people trying to do the same thing, right? Like there are quite a few of us who are connectors, who are trying to bring people together.
Yeah.
Even to the extent that connectors are talking to connectors. So what's missing? What's the missing link? What's not happening that should be happening? Or is it happening? Because that's a question I ask myself sometimes.
Yeah.
When there are a few people that I talk to when they get frustrated about what's not going on, I've actually overtly asked the question, well, maybe it is going on and we're just not seeing it.
Yes. I think that there is some stuff going on. I was just at the British Columbia Health Ministry building like 2 days ago, and there are really good discussions going on, but nobody knows that these good discussions are going on. So they're happening again in a different context where people don't actually have the positional authority to actually make change.
Right.
And so there's a lot of grumbling, but there's actually some people who actually know what's up and who are trying to make change. But then for some reason, those two groups, the peripheral disconnected groups who are talking about the same issues, aren't connecting with the people in the positional power.
Right.
It's just, I think the system is just so complex that nobody knows how to navigate it to get to it, which just in my mind parallels a lot with the patient journey too.
For sure.
Yeah, so. For
sure. And is it Andre Picard who says that, like, I think he references in terms of projects. We've done all the projects. We know all the answers. We're just not implementing them.
Yes.
Which is, I think, quite a profound statement.
That's a super profound statement. We have so much technology, so much evidence of kind of where we should go, and I hope we can talk a little bit about that later. What we think where it should go. But we're not implementing. We're not translating the knowledge. We're not actualizing the things that we actually know into practice. And there are so many barriers to that. I think it's so many of us are on the treadmill, and so many of us actually no longer believe that we actually have any real change agency. So we don't actually devote time to actually making the change. We're just, in healthcare at least, a lot of people are just putting out fires on a constant basis.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to pull over and turn off those beeps.
It's a night of notifications.
This is my family, the family chat.
Should we pause until you do that?
No, we can talk on. I'll probably pull up in front of these two cars and then.
Well, it makes me think about the N of 1 and that concept of that maybe the actual change starts at the bottom, just between the actual conversations that happen between a patient and a physician. I really wonder how much change can be affected just at that level.
So, what do you mean by that? Like, what can we do? Just one doctor and one patient. What can change in that realm?
Well, I have my specific beliefs about that in terms of a lot of the buzzwords that we see on social media, particularly on Twitter, things like the activated patient, the humanized physician, right? In terms of not hiding behind the white coat, really putting yourself out there in terms of who you are as a person, and the patient having that space to bring knowledge into the room, and so that there is actually a dialogue that goes on right in that room. And so if you think about all those projects and all those things that we know already and that have gone on, how do they connect with what's actually happening, or do they, or does it matter? Maybe it's just about that. If we actually have those conversations where a patient feels like a physician has engaged with them and they've represented themselves, they feel like they've truly spoken, is that the change right there? I don't know.
I think what you're saying is that if an individual healthcare professional decides to be truly present and actually listen to a patient and actually provide or deliver care that meets the expectations of the patient, not in any like super fancy way, but just on a human level, that type of good karma, if you want to say it, or positive energy is going to. I thought I shut those off.
It's another one.
Are going to like cause ripple effects within the system, maybe?
I'm asking that. I've never actually thought of it that way before. Like, we talked a lot about the N of 1 on Twitter, right? But now they're actually talking about it in the late night N of 1. Is that possible?
I think it absolutely is, but then I think it is happening. I do know some colleagues who seem to really do that, who really do take the time out and don't seem to work they work with pure intentions. They don't seem to work with that intention of, I have to keep billing more, I have to do such and such. They're actually focused on really just trying to be helpful.
Yeah.
I think at the end of the day, it's just about that kindness, which is important. I'm going to try to shut out what's happened.
I didn't cover all the apps.
How does this work? Let's see. No tones. In-app show preview. Let's give that a try.
Okay.
Let's see what happens now.
Down with the buzzing.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if I think about coming in to talk to a healthcare professional about a problem that I have, the first thing that I want is an opportunity to express it such that I feel like someone's actually listening to me. And of course, then the obvious point of tension is if they've come in late, if they seem stressed, right? And especially if you're a little bit more intuitive, you might be in tune with that and respond to that more than the expression of what's actually going on with you, right? So knowing that someone's arrived and they're there to listen to you makes a huge difference for the patient. But what I've really gained in terms of knowledge is listening to healthcare providers on Twitter talk about burnout and talk about how they might feel coming into that room in that moment, right? So I think my consciousness is a little bit different. So does that change the patient's perspective too, right? If they're aware of that. Okay, my doctor's a human being. It seems like they've been running a little bit late, or maybe they're a little bit distracted. Can I engage with them on that level? Is that okay? Do I know them well enough? Do we have enough of a relationship in terms of a history and what difference does that make, you know, in those 7 to whatever minutes, right?
It sounds like what you're saying is just to be a normal, empathetic human, to really understand where each other are coming from.
Right. Can we both do that in that moment? And then, of course, the challenge is how we're socialized to perceive healthcare providers, right? This is the person with the knowledge. I'm the person with the ask. So if that dynamic shifts, what are the implications for the care that I receive, or the trust that I have for them, or do people even go within with that kind of consciousness? Probably not, right?
Are you saying that the patient's perspective, the one that we might be being a little bit reductionist by saying that I'm the person who with the need to know and I'm approaching an expert, that perspective and the perspective of this expert is also a human with their own stresses, are you saying that that's typically mutually exclusive, those two different concepts? Is that what you're saying?
Not necessarily. I think that's what we're generalizing. I'm generalizing, of course. That's what we're socialized to believe. And I think we're tearing that apart. We're seeing that happen, right?
Yeah.
Because of the problems within the system. So maybe for the wrong reasons and maybe for reactionary reasons, but we are tearing that up. We're beginning to tear that apart. Or just because of the way that we engage with knowledge now, right? Like it's the great Google debate. Those healthcare providers who really react to that notion of their patient coming in having referenced Google, and those that will say, let's sit down and Google together, right? There seem to be different schools of thought in that regard. So what's the provider's perspective on the patient's knowledge and what they bring into the room? And then what's the patient's perspective on their healthcare provider as a human being who doesn't necessarily need to be all-knowing, right?
historically, have you had experiences like that, like of the former type, where there was pushback from the healthcare provider, where they didn't want you to be doing your own research, or they didn't respect the Google, what you found on Google and stuff?
Not overtly.
Okay.
If I think about my experiences, I sometimes wonder if it's maybe a perspective or a perception that I'm imposing on the situation, that I feel uncomfortable bringing that knowledge in.
Oh, okay.
So it may not necessarily be that they disapprove. I don't think I've ever had anyone overtly. I've probably had people shut me down and sort of talk over me in terms of, no, this is where we need to go. This is what I'm looking at. Nothing ever over, other than just that perception or that feeling. And maybe I'm lucky.
I also don't know any healthcare providers who have, in interactions with patients, expressed their displeasure of the patient doing their own research. But I have heard, and I've seen the gripes on social media, hashtag MedTwitter, that where people seem to be upset about patients doing their own research, and that actually kind of upsets me, because I understand the scarcity of healthcare provider availability. So if healthcare providers or professionals are not available, what do we expect intelligent people to do? To just sit there and twiddle their thumbs and wait for information? I'm a proponent for patients helping out and being partners in trying to figure out some of these diagnoses, some of these challenging symptoms and stuff. Of course, it is frustrating when patients come with their extensive Google searches, and these Google searches are potentially off track.
Right.
And of course, the patient does not have the benefit of the background of I don't know, physiologic, biologic, hematologic, histologic studies to know that they're off track, and that's why they're coming to me as a physician. And the moon is beautiful, by the way.
Isn't it? Right?
Wow.
It's a little wedge, everyone.
Wedge, new moon. Anyways, it's.
So can you give me an example of that? Like, I'm trying to think of I'm trying to get my head into that perspective of what that must feel like, right? Because when I read that on Med Twitter, I get my back up a little bit, right? And so, but I also understand what that might look like, because we're different types of searchers, right? Some of us perhaps more astute than others. Some may be more fearful. Your fear is going to have implications for your search, right? In terms of the rabbit holes you might go down, your science knowledge, whatever it might be. So what's something that, let's put it this way, what's something that would concern you? Maybe you can think of a specific example. And what's something that would annoy you? And that's a controversial word.
So, I think the problem, I think what we're seeing, the upsetness that we're seeing on Twitter about this situation, most has to do with the annoying part. The concern part, well, okay, yes, it's mostly the annoying part. And the annoying part is that someone has already gone down the path of potentially erroneous logic, they've gone down a path of misinformation, and they've placed a little bit of paranoia-weighted faith onto this knowledge which is a divergence from a traditional healthcare thinker's analytical process, and then it's my duty as a healthcare professional to try to take the steps to bring them back into what I perceive to be alignment.
So I was just going to say that. So then the annoying part becomes that is the pullback before you can actually then address and get into it.
It feels like an inefficiency.
Interesting.
And that's. I think that's what it is.
How do we make people smarter searchers then? Because they're going to do it.
I absolutely agree with you, and I think what it has to be, there has to be a trusted voice in Google. There has to be a trusted voice that is actually giving out the right information. If we as healthcare professionals who have all that breadth of knowledge and we're not actually giving it out, yes, maybe we're giving out for free, or maybe we can find some other way to leverage some funding to actually give it out for not free, but give it free to the public. And then we won't have to worry about the misinformation so much. But we're not doing that.
Yeah.
And if we're not in that space, giving the information that patients need, how can we expect them to not fall into misinformation potholes? But I always remember when I say that there have been the patients who have actually enlightened me and built my diagnostic knowledge further because of their astute ability to critically think about they have the life experience that's vast and able to actually discern which information is valuable and which is not, and they've actually added to my differential diagnosis in a very valuable way.
Right.
So that happens as well, and I think that health professionals have to acknowledge that often two minds really are better than one. It doesn't matter about your historical experience. And if we look back historically on medical advances, so many of them happened serendipitously, apparently. You know, we're talking about the discovery of penicillin, the discovery of diabetes, and a whole bunch of other things that I can't remember right now. But yeah, so there's value, I think, in allowing everybody to, and not making a fuss about other people doing research and looking more at the intention. The intention is to be self-sufficient, right? Is that not the intention?
For sure.
Yeah, to help yourself.
But the other thing that I immediately think of, which I'm sure won't surprise you because you know where my perspective comes from, is that we're talking about something really linear. So if you're talking about a patient and a physician having a balanced conversation where both bring knowledge to the discussion, or even perhaps a patient who's gone down a rabbit hole and you do have to bring them back and you bring them around, we're talking about the assumption that there's going to be a similar way of thinking. What about the patient who goes down a rabbit hole, and I'll use the phrase, it's not evidence-based, that they feel really strongly about, that you have real concerns about them taking, and they're going to do it, quote unquote, anyway.
Oh.
Right? Because it comes back to that notion of choice. And for me, of course, this is a little bit different, right? But I'm thinking about the context of assisted death, which my husband received, right? So, you know, there's controversy around that, and that there are healthcare providers who don't believe in the provision of that. So that's one example within the system. But outside the system, if people make choices that are not evidence-based and might be even potentially controversial, or that you know might harm them, or might not do anything for them, I think those are the really powerful conversations. And I don't know, I guess I'd be curious as to your perspective on that when you have a patient that comes in that really sticks to a choice that you just know is not going to be good for them.
Yeah.
Or have you had that?
Oh yeah, and it's the cases that come to mind are the cases, and there's been multiple over the years, where patients have been diagnosed with cancer. Radiology and biopsy proves that there's metastatic carcinoma, or that there's one malignant tumor, and the patient makes a decision that they don't want to do any chemotherapy or radiation. And my grandfather went through the same thing, and I think I remember Andy's dad did the exact same thing.
Yes.
Andy meeting at Cancer Geek on Twitter. He's told a story about that at one of his talks. What was that talk again, if they want to find it?
It was a radiology conference,
conference. Anyways, look up at Cancer Geek, and I think it's important that
might be the link might be right in his bio on Twitter, actually.
Okay, yeah. And his name is Andy. What's Andy's last name again? DeLeo.
DLAO.
DeLeo. And what's your Twitter handle, just in case people want to, follow you?
For sure. I'm Bald Girl, so it's BALDGRRL. 2 R's, no I.
It's like girl.
Like Riot Girl from the 90s, if anyone's that old.
Right. Oh, wow. That was a while.
Serious. So those patients who that's an interesting one, because you're even just talking about within an evidence-based system, and I think that really comes down to the whole point of it's the patient's choice.
Yes, and in those cases, we I think most clinicians are are fine to go ahead with it, because we understand, especially the caustic nature of things like chemotherapy, and so we generally are okay with it. But it's a challenge for us, because we do have the experience that multiple patients with the exact same similar diagnoses and staging of their tumors have had fantastic outcomes. And then we have to tell them. So we tell our patients, actually, we know it does say cancer, but this is the type of cancer that's actually treatable, and within a year and a half you'll probably be fine if you go through the process. And the patients are like, no, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do any. I'll treat it with the natural things I'm doing. I'm using cannabis oils, and I think I feel that that's what I choose to do.
Okay.
And then
that's a choice.
That's a choice, and I think everybody has the right to choose what they want for their body. So my job, I see the end of my job is providing all the options and always keeping an open door, saying, if you come back, if you change your mind, if you read something, please come back and let's talk about it, and then we can always change. But I support you in your decision. Unfortunately, in every one of these cases, and there's been about 4 or 5 over the past 9 years, the patients have passed away, and the challenge is that if we did actually do chemotherapy and radiation, many of the patients would have passed away probably anyways.
Well, you touched on something really close to home for me, because, and I think of it again in terms of the activated patient, but specifically with my husband, to tell a little bit about his story, part of which you know, but people watching us won't. When he was first diagnosed, it was stage 4 colon cancer, and the opening words from his first oncologist, because we switched, were, well, we're not curing this.
Wow.
And so he was an individual who was really interested in neuropathy. So he had a pad of paper and he had a spreadsheet, and he really wanted to hear about neuropathy. I think he has since retired.
Oh, okay. This oncologist. Yeah. Oncologist had a big interest in the disease of nerves, neuropathy. Okay.
Yeah. Or, no, I'm probably using the wrong word. It's a side effect of chemo.
Yeah, it is. That's the same thing.
Is it? Okay.
So, pathy is just a pathology, which means disease, and neuro is disease of nerves.
So like the tingling, the cold, the numbness, I'm on the right.
Chemotherapy causes diseases of the nerves. Yeah.
So he was really interested in that, but in those opening words, what was a challenge for me was in my context in having autoimmune alopecia, which is such a hidden context and often one that we tend to know more about than the healthcare provider. So that puts us often in an interesting situation in terms of dialogue.
Say that again, because say it a little slower.
Sure.
What
having autoimmune alopecia is often a real.
Alopecia.
So my alopecia is not. It's not in association with another disease.
And alopecia is ALOPECIA.
Hair loss.
Hair loss.
Right.
And I think you said when you told me in a prior time that we've spoken that it happened when you were about 14. You had lost all your hair.
Yeah. But for so many of us with this disease, it's such a mystery in terms of understanding the why, and we're often given really linear perspectives when what I've come to believe is it's not really a linear disease. It's where I've come to a place where I don't like to use words like cause and cure. I preferred words like triggers. So there could
contributing factors.
Yeah. So, for me, I do think it was stress that triggered my alopecia. I have a friend who, I think it was menopause and hormone change. Sometimes it's illness. Could be, multiple things that trigger, right? So I was coming into this conversation with this oncologist with a very non-linear perspective, but of course it was my husband's experience. And he was 40 years old, and he was angry, and he was afraid. So I bit my tongue and didn't say anything. But I think in those moments, just that kind of introduction, it further closed the door for my husband. His name was Chris. We'll give him a name if he's going to come up again. In terms of,
you mean it made him lose hope?
This is stage 4 cancer, and we're not curing this. So what's the point, right?
Wow.
What's the point? So I quickly went to my science friends afterwards and learned more about curative chemo versus palliative chemo, right? And what those words really mean. And I started digging and tried to offer him those explanations, but he was really closed at that point. We did move on to a different oncologist at a different location, who gave us more information. We changed protocols. He eventually stopped after round 7 because the chemo was taking him down. And so actually that's an interesting, I'll bring this back to something larger, but I'm giving a few details which I think are relevant. In that moment where Chris said, I've had enough, the oncologist had his foot up on his leg and his foot started to twitch.
The neurologist had Chris's foot.
He had his own foot. He was sitting looking at us and he had his legs crossed and his foot was up. The
neurologist had his legs crossed and then had his like foot, his ankle resting on his thigh.
And it started to shake and twitch. And to me, what that really said was, because he was explaining to us, he said, well, you know, the cancer's actually really doing well. I don't think he worded it that directly, but from Chris's scans, things were being contained. And really, given the nature of his cancer, it was actually really good. It moved a little into his lungs. It was in his peritoneum. Obviously, it originated in his colon. But given that we were that far along and it was stage 4 and it was pretty progressive, if you have that medical knowledge, my understanding was that's actually pretty good, which is what the oncologist was saying.
Yeah.
What Chris wanted was for it to all go away.
Yeah.
That conversation never really happened, right? But
that conversation of asking, will it ever go away? You mean that conversation?
Anything around that never really happened. And some of the onus was on Chris, right? As a patient to not express where he was coming from. But it comes back to the humanized nature of things, and that there wasn't really that personal conversation or that personal element included in there. And how would that have changed things if they could have had that conversation?
You mean having the oncologist ask what matters to you? Is that
or Chris even saying, you know what, I feel like I look at that scan and I think, what's the point? And then the oncologist would have had the door open to say, well, actually, if it's only moved that slowly and it's just a little bit in your lungs, we're doing okay here. But to loop back to what we were talking about before, here's the bigger picture, right? So, no, we're not curing this. It's not going to go away. But what does it mean in a larger context if we can keep it at bay and you can have some form of, I don't even know.
Quality of life? No, it's not.
Yeah, well, you know, you can have a little more life. Do you want a little more life? All those sorts of questions, right? So it's not even, you know, if you use the chemo, if you engage with the chemo, I know for sure that based on this type of cancer and the stage that you're at, that it's going to be gone. I feel really confident about that. It's that conversation of, no, it's actually never going away.
Yeah.
But the but is huge, right? And the but is also the personal side of things in terms of, okay, well, what do you believe about that as a patient?
Wow. Yeah.
Right?
Those are the important questions that need to happen. And wow. And they never happened. Are you saying they never happened?
Oh, they never happened. And you know, again, the onus is on the patient too, right? If they don't give the physician a door, you're not going to have those conversations, right? But how does the personality of the physician change the dialogue as well, right? Like, how are you feeling about this? You know, or I'm sensing from your energy that, or you know, those sorts of conversations.
I think I'm fortunate to have a lot of family physician colleagues, and in family practice, there is a lot more of that sensitivity and empathy within the selection criteria for those who are going into family practice, especially in the last 10 years or so. That we're looking for clinicians who will ask, what are your fears, what are your hopes, and things like that. And those are actually, that's part of the curriculum, and preceptors are asked to actually assess trainees on how they do that, on how well and how smooth and how comfortable they make patients feel in those areas. And we are talking specifically to these trainees about using open-ended questions to open up those spaces.
Interesting.
But
that's encouraging to hear, and I've been reading that a lot on Med Twitter, that dialogue is being encouraged and massaged as people are in school.
But then, of course, most of the renowned specialists of the day, most of them have graduated maybe 30 years ago, right?
Yeah.
And so that might have been part of who Chris was seeing at the time.
Well, for sure, yeah. Unfortunately,
So, was it Chris's experience and your experience walking with Chris, you know, as he died, is that what brought you into being, you know, an advocate for non-health professional. Sorry.
We didn't just run a red light.
No, we didn't. That didn't
see
happen.
Is that what made me an advocate? Well, oh goodness, that's a good question. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, like I said, I think I have my roots in an alopecia context. You know, I was on the board of the Canadian Alopecia Areata Foundation for about a year and a half. You know, I really discovered the alopecia community on social media when I first entered Facebook, and that was actually really profound for me. Brought some tears because I thought, gee, at 14, if we'd had social media, this isolated girl on the prairies, Canadian prairies, life would have been really different. I had a horrible first dermatologist, a great second dermatologist, so I had, you know, the gamut of experience, and I had my own opinions, like I wasn't really into wearing wigs and that kind of thing. So I think I've always been some version of an advocate because I'm kind of a walking awareness campaign of sorts. And it's International Alopecia Day. International Alopecia Day today. So
no way.
It is.
Wow.
It's IAD 2019. Hashtag.
Auspicious.
Search that up and you'll see some great pictures.
Auspicious. We're gonna have to
totally
hashtag
auspicious.
that. What's the hashtag?
Hashtag IAD 2019.
IAD.
Yep.
2019.
You'll see my peeps.
How many of your peeps are there?
There's lots of us. There's an Alopecia Areata group on Facebook that has 20,000 members from around the world. However, we're only 2% of the population. Right?
Do you guys have buttons, and the buttons say "I don't have cancer" or something?
Sorry about your bad hair day. There's a Mondo Baldo was a guy who had a t-shirt company for a while, and he obviously had t-shirts for, you know, anyone who was bald in any context, men included, pattern baldness. But yeah, we really liked his t-shirts, and one of them was sorry to hear about your bad hair day. And that was pretty good. So,
That's good.
I think, you know, so I think inadvertently my advocacy context came from there, but because MAiD was so new, Chris died in September 2017, right? So the legislation's like a year and a bit old at
Explain
that point.
what MAiD is again.
Medical assistance in dying.
Yes.
So, and he died at home. A kidney specialist provided his assisted death.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty random in terms of who the doctors are who are interested in providing this, right? Obviously, I think it roots in a personal belief.
Yeah.
I think quite often it rests in that. I've heard, you know, that challenged, but that was certainly our experience. And that, you know, she said to Chris's stepfather, "I really, really hate suffering," and that apparently was what motivated her to engage with the practice. So, and he had a fabulous experience at home. He didn't die happy. That's always my sort of thesis, and maybe what brought me forward to speak about it. And that I think we try to romanticize assisted death as being peaceful, and I think it's really just about choice. So, which kind of goes back to our previous conversation in terms of what is it you want, right? And what is really just your choice. It may not be what your doctor agrees with or what your family agrees with, but so I just started speaking out about that afterwards, and pretty quickly tripped on Dying with Dignity Canada and wrote a blog for them, and wrote another blog, and then did a podcast, and tripped on some grief people and some death people. And
Can you remind people what that podcast was, because it was powerful? What was that podcast again?
the Death Dialogues one was the one that you listened to.
The Death Dialogues. Oh, you've had multiple.
Yeah. There's a woman, a good friend of mine now in Kamloops, who has a grief project as well, and in fact is writing a book based on her experiences in 2015 of experiencing 5 deaths within a year, and really, but there's a whole grief community on Twitter that is profound.
Grief community.
Oh, for sure. I would call them a grief community. People who are openly speaking about grief and theories about how that's not a conversation we're having in society, and the value of that. And, you know, I would link that back to healthcare too.
Doesn't sound like
right?
fun. You know?
No, but grief is a part of, death is a part of life. Grief is a part of life.
It is.
Megan Devine, who wrote the book It's Okay If You're Not Okay, I was listening to her audiobook recently, and she talks about how we're all carrying all this grief with us that has nowhere to go.
Yes.
And so she has this interesting belief that, you know, when someone says, "I'm really sorry to hear about your loved one," right?
Mm-hmm.
And then they tell you their story. And so your experience of grief, which is really new and raw, gets completely lost. And what she says is, those are some of the few moments we have in society to bring our grief out. And if we've got this big bag of it that we're carrying around with us, it's an opportunity for us to unload some of it.
Yeah.
So I think there's a whole grief community out there really challenging us to bring this. Hence why I say my dead husband instead of my late husband. I would say he was never late for anything. So, but let's use the words. He died.
You're being straight up with it.
Yeah.
Real talk. Megan Devine, do you remember what her Twitter handle is?
Refuge in Grief.
At Refuge in Grief.
Yeah.
Megan Devine, and that book, it's
okay if you're not okay.
It's okay if you're not okay. Great read, right? I haven't read it.
Excellent read.
I haven't read it.
Excellent read.
Please
excellent
check it out.
website. She has a writing course. I've met a fellow quote-unquote widow here in town who's become a real fast friend of mine who leads some of the writing courses that she teaches on grief. So there's great stuff out there, for sure. So yeah, that's, I became an advocate, but with all of these communities kind of converging together in terms of grief and death and assisted dying, which eventually just kind of course, you can't help but trip upon people who are speaking about a patient context from a variety of different angles, a caregiving context, which is, obviously merged but separate. If you're spending good portions of your daily life taking care of someone else, that has huge implications. So, which is what you do as a physician.
But mine's easy. Mine's pretty much, I only have those bits of care that a patient only sees me for less than 1% of their lifespan, most of the time, if they're lucky. And then the 99% of the care is delivered by themselves or by their caregivers. And in your situation with Chris, from diagnosis to his death, how long was that process to give people an idea of the time span?
About 8 months.
Wow.
Yeah, if I'm getting that right. Yeah, so he was diagnosed on November the 8th, the day that Trump was elected. Yeah, that's the easy one to remember. And then his assisted death was the day after his 41st birthday on the 25th of September 2017. So yeah, a very short span of time.
But I'm sure it was an intense time. I remember from the podcast. And the podcast again is Death Dialogues.
Death Dialogues,
right? Yeah. Is that on iTunes or is it on? I remember it was on a different one. I think I might have listened to it on something else.
You can find her on Twitter for sure. She's on she's on Facebook. She's on Instagram.
At Death Dialogues.
Yeah, at Death Dialogues.
Okay.
Yeah. And she has a plethora of guests on her show, some really great voices, some of which I haven't had the opportunity to listen to yet. So, yeah, she's a great follow.
What you said that when you joined Facebook and found the alopecia community, what year was that?
When did Facebook start? I want to say 2008, but Facebook was maybe around.
I think Facebook was around 2007. So yeah.
So maybe like the year after. Yeah.
I had this interesting thought today, and I think I tweeted about it. I did actually. That you know how the Yang Gang hashtag Yang Gang Andrew Yang, he's always talking about every transaction done in Amazon and every Google search, a slice of that should go to paying for universal basic income or something. And many of my physician friends on our closed Facebook group are talking about how challenging it is to treat depression and anxiety without access to funded psychotherapy or counseling that's low barrier and easy to access.
Right.
And so I was thinking that in British Columbia, the top corporations who are really successful right now in Vancouver, we ought to ask them and bring them together and say, hey, would you like to sponsor some psychotherapy or something for patients who are marginalized? And contribute. If you're doing really, really well and you know that there are a lot of people who are suffering, I think some of them would be honored to do that. So
it's an interesting question.
Yeah, so I tweeted out to Adrian Dix, he's the health minister, and we have Judy Darcy, who's the Minister of Health. And
she's my MLA.
Yes. That's
awesome.
Right, New Westminster, Have you met her before? She seems like
I have. She's phenomenal.
She seems wonderful.
Yeah. She's phenomenal, incredibly supportive in the community, and
It's so cool.
engages with things like the New West Hospice Society. And yeah, that's fabulous.
We're lucky. We have great leaders. It's just how do we transmit those visions that the leaders have to and actualize them? You know, there's so much suspicion and fear within the different silos that we don't trust each other to really authentically collaborate. You know, and that's
and that goes back to our original question, and that's always the place where I feel like I don't have an answer to grab onto. You know, maybe Andre Picard says we have all the answers, we've done all the projects. Maybe there's the idea of the patient and the physician who have authentic engagement, you know, in those 7 minutes of authentic engagement. But how is that affecting all of the other change that we need, right?
I hope it happens. I hope that more health professionals and caregivers and patients have those authentic engagements, and that spreads and that becomes the norm. That becomes part of the accepted and expected culture. I think that would do amazing things for individualized care and successful outcomes. I think it really would. And I define successful outcomes, just as you said, as what the patient chooses to have the outcome. And there is no sense in me as a health professional trying to dictate when the outcomes are acceptable or when they're not. It's not my life. It's not my body. You know. And I think that there are many physicians right now who have that approach and they understand that.
So did you come to that on your own? Tell us a little bit about your experience in terms of education and how you were educated as a doctor, or did is there a shift in there along the line that was really personal in terms of when you started to practice?
For me, I don't think there was. I think I've always been someone who's kind of other-centered, you know. I think as a young child, you know, I grew up with a father who was in a lot of stress, you know, and in his stress, he would bring a lot of that stress home. And so I lived experiences where a lot of my own autonomy and my rights were removed from me at a very young age, and in a way that was disruptive and traumatic. So having lived that experience, I think it kind of primed me to be empathetic and considerate of those situations, and understanding that everybody's lives are much more than what meets the eye, and that we have to respect that, and understanding the depths of feeling. You know, being someone who feels deeply myself, I understand that everybody has these deep feelings, and that the feelings matter, and that these emotions matter, and so I'm always very careful with anybody I come across in general. So I've never been someone to try to dictate how someone else should behave, and I just hope that in interacting and putting out good karma, that I'll get good karma back, and that's so as a physician, that's my personal behavior.
So was that challenged in med school, or was it supported?
I think it was supported. You know,
Awesome.
I think that it was.
That's encouraging to hear.
It was supported. Did I witness people not supporting it? Yes, all the time. But the teachers who impacted me, or the ones that I chose to listen to, were the ones who were
Fair
like,
enough.
"This is a patient-centered care." Coming up, like I went through medical school in 2001. That was, you know, when the towers fell. That was my first week of school in September, and of medical school. And yeah, that was. It was a time. I think it was a time where, in this millennium, where people are waking up and really understanding. And I think it's been accelerating. That the culture of, I think, compassion is coming. I think it's coming, and it's upon us. And I think that's why we're more aware of when it's lacking. You know, most industry has all become relatively compassionate. The hospitality industry, customer service in the tech industry, even, and the, you know, Google is doing Project Aristotle, which is all about high functioning teams and how people have to feel like they belong and things like that. So
And Brene Brown is everywhere, right? You know,
Love
her little
Brene
empathy
Brown.
cartoon is everywhere, right? So yeah, we use words like empathy and compassion constantly, even if sometimes we don't necessarily know what we're talking about, or you know, they have become a bit of a buzzword. But they're real words. They're not a fad. They're very tangible.
How would you differentiate? I love this discussion about differentiating empathy and compassion. How would you do it?
How ironic, because I'm having if my friend, I have a friend in Belgium, and if he eventually watches this, he will laugh, because we've been having this very conversation for like at least the last week.
Oh, that's funny.
And what's interesting is we've come across different definitions. If you Google it, I think we hit an article that talked about 3 types of empathy, one of which was compassionate empathy. I can't remember the other 2, but I'm in menopause, so we'll just allow that to be okay. And then we came across Brene Brown's video. Well, I pulled that up again in terms of, she talks about the difference between empathy and compassion, and
I haven't seen it.
or empathy and sympathy. She talks about the difference between empathy and sympathy, and she slams sympathy. In kind of along the lines of what I said earlier that Megan Devine talks about, in that like, oh, I'm so sorry, right? Is not versus, empathy is that real connection with someone.
Yeah.
But empathy and compassion kind of have a blur between them, right? I mean, maybe simplistically, empathy is being able to relate. When someone talks about something, you immediately think of an experience that makes you feel a feeling that you think is similar to what they're describing, right? Compassion is maybe perhaps more of an action, is the showing of care that maybe stems out of empathy. Do you have to have empathy to be compassionate? Good question. I don't know. What do you think?
I'd actually never never put a lot of thought into it until spring of 2018. There was a man on Twitter. He's at WestM61, Michael West. I think he's the head of thought leadership at the King's Fund.
Okay.
The King's Fund is a healthcare research organization, probably the biggest of its kind in the UK. Really great organization as far as I can see. I'm a huge fan of theirs. Oh, are we getting blocked off?
I don't think so.
Anyways,
Might be a fireworks thing.
so yeah, he'd come over and to the Quality Council, the BC Patient Safety Quality Council. I think we spoke about that recently. And he the way he defined it, he defined compassion as first off, listening. You know, that in order to have compassion, one must listen, and he says listen with fascination. I love that.
That's awesome.
Put together. He said he had a friend, and I can't remember the name of that friend. It was a lady who shared that with him. That listening with fascination is the beginning of compassion.
Right.
And then after listening, there's the empathy, and he puts empathy within the act of compassion. And then the third part is understanding. So you listen with fascination, with empathy, to understand, and to understand deeply. And understanding, I think, it doesn't simply mean, as you'd said, a linear causality, but that the things are multifactorial, that things are like branches in a tree kind of thing most of the time, and that deep, profound listening. And then the next part, the very last and critical part of compassion that Michael West expounds on, is that there needs to be intelligent action combined in it, or at least a desire for an intention for it's an intention for intelligent action. So you got the listening, you have the understanding, empathy, listening, empathy, understanding, and then intelligent action, and then that he calls that compassion.
Wow.
And then and then he calls it, and the context was that he was delivering a 40-minute or so discussion on compassionate leadership.
Okay.
Because he feels that this is a missing link within health and care leadership. That we have leadership, a whole bunch of different styles of leadership, but then he feels that potentially the most effective one is a compassionate leadership, because a compassionate leadership would create that safety amongst peers, amongst change agents, that would empower and potentially create psychological safety in a way that would allow all the new ideas that we're getting to come to the surface and to really bring in and evoke the talent and the wisdom within a team, and having every member speak up, put it all together, amalgamate it into a ball of a vision, and then suss out the vision, and then create the priorities, and then actualize it through an organization. So out there in the King's Fund at the UK, they've actually developed a curriculum specifically on compassionate leadership, and I'd never thought that you could actually do like a course in health and care on compassionate leadership, and I'd be stoked to take it. I just don't know how to access it. I would probably have to fly across the pond and do it.
It's not online.
I don't think so.
No.
It's not.
Wow.
But yeah, he's such a lovely person, and he's written a few books, most of them based on mindfulness practice. And he had this presence, he had this aura when he came, like, that depth in the eyes, like really beautiful person kind of thing, and it was tangible on that point. So that was his delivery, and like you could see that he walked his talk, and that was really impactful. I think that integrity that he held. He had a lot more in it, and that's on YouTube too. If you on YouTube, if you guys check out Compassionate Leadership, BC Patient Safety and Quality Council, the video will come up. It's about 44 minutes. I enjoyed it. Some people didn't really follow on, but I thought it was great.
Interesting. I saw you post about him recently. He wasn't someone I was following, so he's like a new follow. But I've been taking a bit of a Twitter break, so I haven't been engaging as deeply. Yeah, I found that I was madly bookmarking and then not going back to things, so I felt like I had to roll it back. But so there's two things I think about based on what you just said, and one is, who are the healthcare leaders? Because I see this hashtag on Twitter all the time. This might have actually been the first medical hashtag, like when I really started to delve into advocacy, that caught me. And so who are the healthcare leaders? Because in my mind, it would be, well, I guess there's actual tangible leaders in positions of leadership, and then there's the leaders.
Yeah, so,
right?
So Michael Weiss calls it the formal leadership and informal leadership, and I think many people use that term. So I often refer to myself as an informal leader within health and care, but I actually do have some formal positions as faculty on the Physician Quality Improvement team at Fraser Health, and I'm also the head of family practice at Sarah Memorial Hospital. So those are my formal roles, but informally, like I often cross silos intentionally and do my leadership there anyway. Like I make, and part of that leadership is being courageous and then just saying your truth. And then seeing what bounces back and being open to learn from every experience and expressing things, kind of like how we're doing this podcast right now. This, in my opinion, is an act of leadership. Be courageous, to show ourselves relatively authentically, hopefully, as much as possible, and to speak our truths and to get what we're passionate and what we feel is important out there. And I think that's what leadership is.
And is that the answer? The more informal healthcare leaders you have, the more change, the more true healthcare, the more medicine actually occurs. You know, I'm thinking of Andy's distinction, Candace Geek's distinction between healthcare and medicine, and how often he emphasizes the need for the focus on the art of medicine, right?
Yes, yeah.
So,
and Cancer Geek just recently reposted his, I think it was a February 2018 video, about 11 minutes long, of where he expounded on the difference between healthcare and medicine. I found that really helpful.
And the two Greek names I'm not going to remember because it's dark out.
Gosh, because it's dark out.
Yeah, it's too late for my brain to remember long Greek medical names.
Caduceus was the wrong one. Caduceus was he's about commerce and stuff.
Right. He's the one that got grabbed onto.
Caduceus. I don't know. I don't remember the actual stories. I just know that's the one with the two snakes.
Which is the more common.
And that's the more common one, but that's like
actually the wrong symbol.
It's an erroneous. It was a mix-up. Somebody just accidentally used that particular symbol. And the real one is, it started with an A, right? Asclepius or Asclepius.
Yeah, Andy's going to laugh at us when he hears this. Yeah.
Sorry, Andy. But yeah, I think that was neat, and he was showing how he mirrored how we've actually, by potentially accidentally choosing the wrong mythology, our culture has followed suit and gone a little bit commercial, especially within the United States. and a little bit here as well, I would say. And I guess some of that commercialism that I experience here is potentially family physicians caring so significantly about billing rather than providing excellent patient experience, kind of weighing more on that. Of course, everybody still cares about the patient experience, but weighing much more on whether or not they are reaching their financial goals.
Right.
You know, and that's challenging.
Which kind of loops back to the sort of second question that was in my mind when we talked about compassion, and that's and we talked about being authentic, right? Which is a big word in my field, in archives. Being authentic, being reliable. We talk about that in terms of the record, the information being something you can rely on, but it's something we can talk about with people too, right? So it seems to me that for a healthcare professional, a physician, to be truly compassionate, there's a tall order in there, in that they have to be authentic. Yes. They have to have emotional intelligence. Yes. So we're asking a lot of them as individuals in terms of being actualized and aware and conscious and open and communicative. We're asking them to be superhumans, right?
I don't know about that. I think we're
just human.
We're just asking them to be human.
Yeah.
And I think we've not asked people to be. We're not expecting people to be human. Yeah. When we ought to. And as you'd said earlier, with the nephrologist, I think nephrologist, oncologist. Yeah, you were saying the oncologist. You said the personality type matters. You know, it's luck of the draw almost, which oncologist and which personality comes along with that oncology degree.
You have no control over it.
Yeah, and there is no qualification like this person's human and this person's a little bit different human. You know, you can't predict that.
Or even just, can I see their humanity? I may not like it, I may not engage with it, but can I at least see it so that I can interview it and decide if it's a humanity I want to engage with?
So I can do my comparison shopping. You know,
for sure.
Yeah. Oh gosh.
It just seems like a tall order.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like it's completely possible, and I think some of that onus falls on medical training, admissions, selection criteria people. You know, the admissions committee. I think, and I feel that at least in British Columbia we are doing a little bit of that. But can an admissions committee be tricked? Absolutely.
Can you really see that in someone? Yeah, for sure.
And there are so many people who are highly competitive who know how to behave in a certain interview to come across a certain way. We all know that.
Yeah, for sure. But I'm really heartened to hear, and I mean constantly reading it on Twitter in terms of the culture shift in medicine and the implications of that for the care that's provided. But it also makes me think, as we're talking about what are the implications for the patient and for the caregiver, that, you know, if you have these superhuman quote unquote providers, is it set a tone and example? Does it open the door for the patient to increase their emotional intelligence, to increase their compassion? And then what are the implications for their healthcare outcomes when they engage with the provider, right? Like it cracks it all open.
Like so many of my personal shifts in life where I felt that I've made significant personal development shifts came when I met people like Michael West or like Jana who inspire me, right? And if your family doctor was someone who really inspired you, and I've had people tell me that their family doctors have inspired them, what amazing outcomes it's that butterfly idea of that, just the simple interaction can actually of that 10-minute interaction could actually, on a consistent basis where you develop a trusting relationship, could spread out to the rest of their lives and impact their families and their children and everything.
So completely. And there's the revolution, right, in terms of learning to take care of yourself. I feel that we need to note that Lawrence is driving in the dark of Stanley Park, which is really impressive. Bravo, you.
I've done a lot of, well, thank you for having a strengths-based approach, because I committed a lot of fouls earlier. And RCMPMs, sorry.
And bravely driving in the direction of the fireworks.
Are we?
We should
Wow.
be careful of the fireworks.
I'm
We
actually
get stuck.
I'm driving on autopilot, so like
Wherever we go, we
how
go.
did we end up here? Who knows?
I just think that in the dark of Stanley Park is quite impressive. But
A lot of people have been murdered in these. Anyways, right, Picton and stuff. Yeah. Anyways, so you have a lot of big things coming up. You were saying to me earlier on Twitter, like, I cannot get sick.
And I am. Except that I talked to my medicine today. I had a flaky moment with my, it's one of the omeprazole drugs. What do you call it? It's PPI, proton pump inhibitor.
That's right. Beautiful.
Yes.
Yeah.
If there's an acronym, I'm all over it. But yeah, I had a little chat with my medicine and just said I'm struggling with a little bit of gastritis, in case anyone actually cares to know, and just kind of said, you got a job to do. I'm not really liking your side effects, but get busy, because I'm going to Toronto next weekend for the Canadian Medical Association Health Summit.
Oh my gosh.
Which is super exciting.
So that's the Canadian Medical Association where like Dr. Gigi Osler will be, Dr.
Yep.
Sandy Bookman, and
Julie Drury, all the patient people who
Julie Drury.
Maggie.
At solid footing.
So excited
Maggie
to meet
who? Maggie again?
Kenistecki. Oh, Maggie, if I said it
Maggie.
properly.
Wow.
Yeah. And I think her tag is just her name. So I'm
Spell
like
her name, come on.
Kenesteci. They used to call me Webster in high
I
school.
am so impressed. I could never spell it, but
I can spell Czechoslovakia really fast.
wow. Do it now.
CZECHOSLOVAKIA.
ENCYCLOPEDIA.
Oh, we
That was-
have a shared skill.
That was my encyclopedia.
Excellent.
Anyways, nice.
So I'm really excited to go to this to meet the people, but I also feel it kind of goes back to the imposter syndrome in that I think it kind of balances it a little bit in that, wow, they chose 50 patient and caregiver advocates to be fully funded to attend this. So my registration, my hotel, my airfare is all covered, which is amazing to be able to bring people from across the country together to hear these perspectives.
That's equity because, physicians are paid to go. I mean, probably, I'm guessing. Some of them are.
I saw a doctor on Twitter talk about how she won't be there because she only picks one event per year just based on the costs. So
Okay.
I don't know if any. That's a good question. If any
Okay.
physicians actually get funding to be there.
Okay.
So, but then about 4 days ago, I was also contacted to ask. So they're having something that they're calling. Oh shoot. There are stations during the breaks that are really
Okay.
interactive,
Yeah.
trying to encourage smaller dialogue. So I've been asked to lead
Like
one
a
of these
rapid fire or
dialogues.
something.
Yeah, I want to say like general store, but that's not what they're calling them. But it's something along that idea. They've got
Cafe,
a little buzzword that in terms of bringing people together in smaller groups. So and it's meant to be more dialogue. I've been told I don't have to present, thank God, because could I write that up in time?
So it's about facilitating.
Yeah, so just they want me to talk a little bit about MAiD and then see where that goes.
Yes.
So that's super exciting.
Talk about your favorite resources for learning more about MAiD or
Resources. Well, Dying with
Online.
Dignity Canada is
Dignity Canada.
definitely. So there are 3 organizations in Canada, and if I'm missing anybody else, my apologies. But so you have DWDC, Dying with Dignity Canada, which is an advocacy organization, really powerful, really authentic. Where I got engaged with them was in sharing blogs, and they have a plethora of blogs. I mean, I think for physicians who are considering their perspective on MAiD, it's a great place to actually read about people's experiences, as well as for caregivers, for people who are thinking about MAiD as a choice. So they're an incredible organization, and they've just established a first-person witness council, which is loved ones of people who have chosen MAiD. So that's a powerful addition to work that they do. And then there's the Canadian Association of MAiD Assessors and Providers, CAMAP, who just had their annual conference here in Vancouver, which I think was only their 3rd. So they're really grassroots. I don't know if you're familiar, but it sounds like they just all met through, a billboard and saying, hey, how are you doing this? This is what I'm doing. How are you doing this? And that was an amazing experience to attend and to sit in those dialogues as a caregiver and really feel. At the end, we actually we debated a couple of cases. And so I wasn't sure if I'd feel like a fish out of water, and I had to kind of bite my tongue a bit. I wanted to go up to the mic and say a few things. So that was really cool. And then there's Bridge C14, which is geared more particularly towards supporting loved ones of people. You know, when the legislation hit and people start to make this choice, Dying with Dignity has a psychologist that actually, a therapist that does support people and talk them through, but this is one person, right? And so you're starting to see now the growth of other organizations around it. I think there's some smaller forces coming into being as well that are providing counseling and group support, because with the idea being that it's potentially, well, I believe it is a different form of grief than you might experience with a quote-unquote natural death.
A different form of grief.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we talk about two words. We talk about anticipatory grief, which of course you could have if you know that someone has a time frame. But when you actually have a date, like when Chris's 41st birthday was the day before he died, and so we went out and got him his favorite cake, and we put the cake in front of him, and all of us sat kind of looking at him. And so, in true to form, because he was quite a personality, he started to sing the song All By Myself. And he just belted it out and went for it. And, you know, and because I think we're all like, this is so surreal.
Yeah.
Where you're eating a birthday cake the day before you die, and we know you're going to die, right? So anticipatory grief.
Yeah.
And then disenfranchised grief is another word we toss around too, because maybe I can't talk to you about my husband's experience because you don't believe in it.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Maybe I can't talk about my husband's experience in my workplace because I work in healthcare, and maybe I work in a religious institution, and I know it's not going to be accepted there.
Yes.
So I have to exclude my, discussion of my experiences and the things I'm feeling afterwards. So those are sort of the two big words.
Kind of edit yourself.
Yeah.
What was the latter one again? First one, anticipatory.
Anticipatory and disenfranchised.
Disenfranchised.
So yeah.
Wow. Vocabulary is so valuable.
Extremely, extremely. And to break down some of these more human concepts as well, right? So what's on your plate, Lawrence, in terms of upcoming, because you are it seems like you're always attending some kind of training or meeting or whatever it might be.
Yeah, it's funny. At Nats for Docs, who's become a really good friend of mine over the past year, she'd said, we were talking about a little bit about, it wasn't specifically, we didn't use the term existential suffering, but we'd come across, we're in a very honest place in our friendship where where I've asked her, if you see stuff of mine that I put on social media that looks like I'm stuck in my ego, or I'm doing something kind of not really good for the universe, please let me know. So she'd said, it looks like you're really scattering your energy. She said,
oh, wow.
It looks like you're putting it here and you're putting it there. And I said, yeah, I'm hungry, or actually it's with thumbs, I'm hungry for knowledge, so I'm really hungry to learn, and that's why I'm going to all these conferences and stuff. And she said that, how you always talk about how people seem to be suffering, sometimes sometimes it looks like to me that you might be suffering in that your curiosity to learn is taking you to all these different places. And I think she might have had a point that I'm actually putting off that critical essentialism that is sometimes necessary to really make major personal or bigger shifts for the collective, that potentially collective, when I say collective, I mean collective humanity, that sometimes there's a focus that needs to happen in order to actualize some really meaningful, shifts in the world. And that, so I might be distracting myself with doing all these different things. Who knows?
Well, I can relate to that because I think definitely my path has been of constant knowledge consumption on different topics, and I feel myself move right now. I feel like I'm kind of moving out of more of a MAiD focus towards a more generalized patient caregiver perspective, and I'm asking myself lots of questions, which may have been why I've stepped back off of Twitter a little bit, right? But that's a really profound concept because that. Does it happen? Is it natural, or do you have to be maybe perhaps triggered or jarred by someone else or even yourself to say, hey, stop the knowledge acquisition?
Yeah.
I don't know. I think in my mind that kind of feels a bit unnatural. I think, wouldn't you just know?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I was like, it feels so good to learn new things. Like there's so much reward in it for me, and I just feel my mind expanding, and it hasn't always been this way. Like this, since coming out of Burnout, this is when these kind of expansion things have happened, and since I've become open and started to make, you know, really meaningful connections, you know, our connection, Jana, you're and mine, and a whole bunch of different connections.
Yeah, it's amazing. I'm jealous that you got to meet her recently.
I know, it's so cool. I mean, I just followed, like, I met her I first spoke to her over Zoom in November, and then I'm just blown away by Nat's intelligence and her ability to facilitate groups in such a loving way. Like, I've never seen anybody manage that complexity of facilitating a virtual group online and do it in such a compassionate way, where she's able to keep track of everybody, which so she's like unlocking parts of her brain that are like just unlike outlier abilities kind of thing. And it's like there's something behind that. And then she's like, early on in our relationship of doing some of the training for Safe Space Health, which is a really wicked project.
I was going to say, you should mention the tags here for both her and Safe Space.
Safe Space Health, and then at Nat4Docs. I think it's FOR. Oh,
yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Nat4Docs.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Got an archivist there for me. And yeah, so she said, hey, potentially in this training we may, some of us may meet up in India. And I'm like, meet up in India? Oh, okay, that sounds great. And then fast forward like about 6 or 7 months later, I'm booking my tickets for India because I'm just drawn to try to see what this is about.
Wow.
Many of the moderators there had met in India, and so yeah, my wife and I, Sharmila and I went out there and got back 3 weeks ago, and yeah, it was a fantastic experience. And yeah,
I didn't realize you were meeting her in a more formal context. I thought it was just like happened to be there at the same time.
Oh, no. It was it was intentional too.
So say more about that. That's really
so, you know, after you witness someone do things that you don't think you never knew people could do, which is how she relates to people and how she communicates so fantastically, and facilitation. Like, I've been drawn to facilitation techniques and facilitation skills since I was at this, like, March of 2018. I attended a Ministry of Health event where there was a group, Delaney and Associates. This is a professional facilitation company.
Okay.
I think we're in the traffic for the fireworks now.
I believe we are.
And then the way that they were able to really, the people who were professionally trained in facilitation, get everybody in the rooms intention and sense, you know, that have that affective intelligence that was able to sense that person has a question, like, without any verbal or even
read the energy in the room kind of thing.
Reading the energy. It was just fantastic. It was something I'd never experienced before until that moment. And what happened is that everybody in the room was just like super aligned. They were like, everybody's brains were kind of, if I could imagine doing functional MRIs on everybody in the room, and everybody would be lighting up in the same centers of the brain. I was like, this is a magical thing, and this is what we need.
Convergence.
If we're going to FTS, if we're going to fuck the silos and actually get people together in a room, this is the technology we need to really get everybody on the same page. So I was like, I got to learn facilitation. Fast forward about, a few months later, I was in Boston learning facilitation at the Institute of Healthcare Improvement. And I had not gone there specifically to learn that. I was there to learn coaching, but the coaching actually had facilitation skills within there. And then right around that time, right after I'd graduated from that program, then I meet Nat4Docs. And then she does this like superb facilitation that was out of the park. And
so you were building there, right? Like, there's the knowledge build.
But it's coming so fast. It's coming in succession. Yeah. So I was like, I feel like this is probably something that's meant to be. I've always been open to just following kind of where my heart leads me or whatever. And so in that moment, it led me. I got to meet Nat. gotta make this connection a little deeper. I gotta learn from her. And I'm meeting her there. We went to a really fantastic location. It was kind of like a meditative place, a religious place in the Hindu religion.
Okay.
And my wife was born about 2.5 hours from there, it turns out. And she'd never been back. She hadn't, to that specific location.
Yeah.
But she hadn't been back in 20 years. So we actually went in, before we went to meet Natalie, we went to the hospital where she was born, and we took selfies there and stuff like that.
Oh, what an amazing experience.
Yeah, it was really special. And yeah, so that was awesome, meeting Natalie there and just really talking about this issue. Natalie has such a huge heart for healthcare professionals who are burnt out. She understands the mechanisms a little bit deeper than anybody else I've spoken to, and in a more fair and objective sense of it, almost a scientific viewpoint, a really top-down perspective.
And she's not afraid to step in, and she does it in a very particular way, right?
Yeah,
so it's really profound to watch.
It is profound, and then the way she's able to communicate things, it's because she is a deeply spiritual and disciplined person, and she's experienced so many things and gone through a lot of grief to come to where she is, similar to yourself, and to many people who are compassionate, and she does it out of a motivation simply to help, just like what we all want to do is to help the world and trying to help the world move faster, do our part, really, to do what we're called and what we're able to do. And so she has these skills, she's recognizing them in herself, and she's using them to the best of her ability, and that's inspiring me to try to do something similar in the same way. And yeah.
So out of that, the question in my mind is, like, you're talking about the concept of facilitation and how it really means something to you. That's what's really caught you. So what you've learned so far about facilitation, how does that change you as a doctor? And then what does it make you want within healthcare outside of actually practicing medicine?
So it changes. So the concept of facilitation, and this is very similar because I learned facilitation within the context of a coaching course at the Institute of Healthcare Improvement. And one of the foundational principles of coaching is that the coach needs to hold on to a systems perspective, not getting into the deep minutia and getting in a zoomed in approach, but having some time in there, but also mostly looking at the strategic movements that need to happen in order for the coachee to actually advance at the most rapid or at the most acceptable pace possible. And part of that is also being non-judgmental, meaning, like, if we put our ego into a situation where we're trying to assist someone in a helping process, we become mired or blinded to other opportunities that could exist because our ego is potentially constraining the potential opportunities in whatever situation.
Makes total sense.
To some situation.
Back to that idea of choice, right? Like, it could affect someone's ability to choose.
Exactly. So being non-judgmental, and part of that is also not having an emotional response or a negative judgmental response to whatever your coachee has chosen or is hoping to choose or is bringing up, or wherever their stage is not like saying, oh, you're down here and you're dumb and I'm up here. That doesn't make any sense. And so all of these types of relationship situations apply to the N of one situation too.
I can totally hear that. That's all about practicing medicine, right?
It is. That's what it is. And so when you break it down,
interesting.
That same approach of being non-judgmental, being open, and having a helping, asking questions, asking open-ended questions, and that's really what you're supposed to do in facilitation as well. Yeah, you're supposed to do that.
Give space, right? Make space.
In friendships, you're supposed to do that. In parenting, you're supposed to do that.
Relationships.
In teaching.
Yeah.
You're supposed to do that in leadership. So it's been a great journey and just learning a lot of really transferable skills, and I'm excited that you're going to be doing a little bit of that in Toronto.
My biggest challenge is that my truest voice is written, or at least I believe that. There might be some people who would challenge me on that.
Yes.
Because people say, you're such a great speaker. I'm like, you have no idea how scary that was. I really feel like I can break down my thoughts better in writing. So I mean, another thing I'm doing in the future is I'm because I've done my training through Patient Voices BC, which is an amazing organization. I'm so in awe of, and it's new for me, so that's probably part of it, but just that opportunity to engage in so many different contexts and provide a patient or caregiver perspective. So I'm going to be doing some training for new staff with Providence Health when I get back the same week from the CMA conference. And so I'm just going to do what I feel most comfortable with, which is what I did last year when I did a Pecha-Kucha. I read it. Which is not really what you do for a Pecha-Kucha, if I'm going to say it properly. You know, it's supposed to be very inspired and you just talk for your 20 seconds per slide or whatever. So these are all good experiences for me. So I think Toronto and the Grand Central, that's what it's called, at the Grand Central, will be good in terms of that's not something where I can read from a piece of paper. But yeah, so I'm learning too, and maybe I need to do a little bit of facilitation training. Maybe that would help.
I think what we just talked about is the meat and potatoes of it, and as long as you're staying really aware of who's in the room and just reading body language, as you already do really well. Like you're talking about how the oncologist's foot was up there and bouncing up and down, kind of like showing his upsetness or his inability to accept what was happening.
I think a lot of it too in those moments, you know how I would describe it is his hands were tied. So literally to the point that his foot was twitching, his feet were tied. And that, like, to me, what it said was, I can do something here, and you're not going to let me do it. Yeah,
it's like,
I have to respect your choice, but
it's almost like
I could make this work.
Come on.
Yeah, right. So here's an interesting point, and I think that's actually because this is more. Well, I'll just put it out there. In listening to this, I know for me, and I think this speaks to the role of an advocate, that I'm not actually a caregiver. In personality type, this has come up recently. Someone said to me, I'm a disruptor. And I think that often that's what advocates do, right? Is disrupt, is come in and say, hey, what about this? Have you thought about this? So that totally goes not against. One could say that's almost more complementary, hopefully in a positive way, to what you're just talking about, right? Because what you're talking about in terms of facilitation and coaching and opening up space and open-ended is very caregiving. But there's another role that contributes to change, and I think it's actually the one that I identify with more, which maybe is what makes it difficult for me to facilitate things, right? Because I want to come in and kind of, have you thought about?
So yeah, I mean, and I think any skilled and trained facilitator out there will say this, that with facilitation skills you can actually guide a discussion any which way you want, and that's kind of a little bit of a scary skill.
So you could disrupt and facilitate at the same time.
You could absolutely disrupt, but of course there's ethics behind it, you know, so you have to, but I think if you're behaving as authentically as possible, if you're not being bought by somebody else or doing something for some ulterior motive, I think you're allowed to do that. I think being your true self, and as long as you're asking yourself, am I doing this because it's for the greater good? Because is this for good for the collective? Is this, you know, that type of idea? And I think that following your heart and however it happens in Toronto, I think that'll work out, even if you do feel like you're disrupting while you're facilitating. Did you learn about that at all in terms of studying coaching and facilitation, like different personality types or different types of facilitators? No. What we did learn was some of the general principles, and we also learned techniques on how to manage different challenges within the group that you're facilitating. So it's more about like putting the hat on, right? Putting the facilitator or the coaching hat on, which is interesting to think about in terms of what I'm just saying, in terms of, and it comes back to that sort of emotional intelligence. Okay, well, I'm putting a hat on, but under that hat, what kind of person am I? Am I a caregiver? Am I a disruptor? What style do I bring to my facilitation? I personally do not enjoy self-limiting labels and narratives, but it makes life easier, right? We have to. And can you explain to me again what an archivist does? Because I really do you say archivist or do you say archivist? Archivist. I really have no idea. What archiving could be the verb, but most of us who've been trained as archivists don't really like to use that verb. The verb makes us cringe. What do I do? My word. Archivists are about
recorded information, right? We're about evidence. So we're the impartial caregivers. Okay, we're taking care of information, right? Now, in our modern times where we talk about subjectivity and impact, obviously, in terms of our dialogue around truth and reconciliation in this country and in other countries, it's raised some really interesting points of concern and conversation for archivists because we say that we're impartial, right? So, what I do in the day-to-day is, and I don't do it as directly anymore because I'm more project basis, I take care of government information. I make sure that it remains authentic and reliable because it's in the legal custody of an archives now. So that's sort of the basic premise behind an archives is to take information in, be impartial, make sure that it stays in its physical context. There's no alterations made to it. So when you come in to look at it, I'm the one who guarantees that it's exactly as it was when the person who created it gave it to me.
Wow.
So there's a chain of custody there, right? The creator passes it on to the archives, whatever however they might be, either private or public in terms of the type of creator. And then it's my job to ensure that, this hasn't been tampered with, because you may need to take that information as evidence and use it in court. Or, and even on a more informal level, you might be interested in family genealogy. So you really want to know that this is true, right?
The reason I asked you is I was wondering if your job involved some type of categorization of documents at all the time or something like that.
We have a lot of terminology for sure.
Okay. So and that type of neuroprogramming would really drive you to want to potentially categorize yourself and to label yourself as a certain type or whatever. But so personality type assessments that I've become aware of. I've the Myers-Briggs. I've never done that myself, but I'm aware of it.
I have a teenager who could help you with that. She and her friends talk Myers-Briggs at lunch.
That's awesome. And there's the DISC, DISC. I've never done that one.
That one. Is that the blue, green, red, yellow? The color quadrants?
There's the color triangle that I know of. I don't know about a quadrant one, but the color triangle one is strengths deployment inventory. And that one I am trained in. I did some training in that one last, I think, a year and a half ago. And that one divides people into kind of like the analysts, the performance focused, and the kind of people focused, and then in the middle there's the hub, or the people who seem to try to consult with everybody before things are made. But
I'm trying to remember. I have one of my undergrads is in psychology, and I'm trying to remember which class it was where we focused on, maybe it was personality, if that's an actual psych class. But we did 22 different personality tests in the class. So and that's like a long time ago. Fun. So I can only imagine. Well, like anything, right? Labels are what you make of them.
But you really found that caregiving and disruptor are mutually exclusive labels or identity?
Well, it's an interesting conversation if I'm sitting here representing, caregivers as a caregiver advocate, right? And I think maybe it does loop in what we're just talking about in terms of personality. It's something that it's been a point of tension for me on social media, in speaking from as a caregiver, right? Particularly most recently, what's driven me to speak has been having cared for someone who died, right? And so there are certain assumptions that go along with that concept. If I'm a caregiver, I'm nurturing, I'm loving, I'm gentle, I'm maybe potentially more docile, right? But I'm not those things as a personality. I tend to want to come in there and slice and disrupt. It's not, disruptor is a completely new word for me, something that a friend offered me, but it's one that kind of made me go, oh, does that describe the way I take action, right? So I think there's an interesting point of tension there, speaking from a caregiver perspective, but with maybe a little bit more sharpness. Personally, I find it valuable. And for me, it's looking, I think, at the totality of my life, too, in terms of having been socialized female, having been socialized by a mother who really raised me to care for her, emotionally, right? So there's the way that I've been socialized that might fit into that construct of caregiving, but there's innately me who wants to, I often identify myself as a gaps and overlaps person. I'm really fascinated by gaps and overlaps. And I like to, which was what, because I don't actually identify as being an archivist professionally, I prefer to say I'm a bureaucrat. I love that. I love the big chaos of big government. And being able to do things like identify gaps and overlaps and create efficiencies. Lean management really fascinates me. All those kind of concepts, I think they're, how can we make this better? How can we make this actually work? And not just have a process for the sake of a process, or a policy for the sake of a policy. Which comes back to some of our questions about how do we make healthcare better, right?
Sounds really helpful for healthcare.
These are very recent questions for me, but I think they're very valuable. And personality type. I didn't take any tests to clarify this, but the word disruptor I think really resonates with me in terms of what my personal style is. And I think that potentially it does make me more authentic when I take action, right? Because I step more naturally in it. Now I might alienate some people. I may not, come off. I may not feel as comfortable around me, but I'm more authentic. So I think at the end of the day, that's better, and hopefully that makes me better in the advocacy work that I do, in the engagement work that I do, the stories that I share.
Absolutely. I think most of the caregivers that actually become aware of are those who have the assertiveness and the courage and the drive to be authentic that actually bring them into my exam room, because otherwise it would just be the patient. But if someone cares enough to disrupt the trajectory that the N of 1 is going at, that means that the caregiver, I think, is a disruptor. And I think
interesting.
I think you have to be as an advocate and a caregiver. You must be. If you have information that is not going into the calculation of what the next step will be, you have to step in and you have to disrupt, right?
I think you're totally right. I've never thought of it that way, especially if I think of some of the social media dialogue I've seen around this in terms of not feeling like, advocates who are parents, right, as caregiving parents, not feeling like there's a place for them to engage in the assessment, of the dialogue around the assessment of their child, or, it's totally a disruptor role for sure. That makes total sense. Yeah,
it is, and that's the context through which I meet most family caregivers. I want to give a shout out to, I think it's Caregivers BC. Do you know the website for that?
Family Caregivers BC?
Family Caregivers.
I just became aware of them. I didn't know they existed.
Okay.
Yeah, I was offering some feedback to a hospice-based organization, and they told me about them, so I didn't know they existed. So I think it's Family Caregivers of BC or BC. Yeah.
And they provide support to caregivers who feel like they're burnt out, or even hopefully preemptively, like upstream, before you get burnt out. Connect with Family Caregivers BC and then try to get support services. There are support groups, because we know that 99% of the time the health of your loved one is in your hands, and that's a huge burden if you've never been trained professionally on how to do that. So
for sure. And this is a huge dialogue, right, that needs to be on the table even more than it is already, because of our aging population, because of the pressures within our healthcare system, the backlogs, that so much of that health-based role falls to family quite often, right? So that's a pretty critical dialogue. For sure. Those are the people I think who really inspire me the most on social media, who speak from those perspectives. That's where I felt like I'm gobbling up the knowledge, because I don't think I had that consciousness around my own role. So to be able to kind of to mirror it or look at it and think about, okay, how can I contribute to this dialogue to make change?
So next week you'll be in Toronto, and then what was the other group that had asked you to do? No, that was in the same. Your second event
is within CM, the health summit.
That's right.
Yeah.
So you do kind of like pulling double duty within there, or you're kind of like the chosen one to guide some talk. Wow.
To guide a little narrative. So
that's amazing.
Yeah, I'm quite overwhelmed, and I'm super stoked about it. Yeah, if I can just keep my stomach calm, then everything will go well. Just eat rice cakes for 5 days. Everything will be great.
Yeah.
And then I come back and have a patient at Voices experience. So that's
Yeah,
going to be really
and that'll be a
exciting
training thing?
Yeah, training new staff.
your
I think
staff?
predominantly will be nurses
Okay.
that day.
Ah.
So
What does
that's
that
really
mean?
exciting for me.
How do Patient Voices train new staff? What does that mean?
So we're just integrated. This is very new for me, right? People who've done the Patient Voices training and signed the agreement and put themselves forward for patient engagement. It looks like there's a plethora of different contexts, but in this particular one, it's bringing your story to training new staff who might be new within their particular professions. They might be quite seasoned and they've just come to new jobs within an institution. So what I'm still playing around with what my presentation is going to look like, but talking about positives and negatives in different contexts. So what I've ended up actually doing is looking at my pinned tweet, which I've used the hashtag #MyHealthCareBeliefSystem, and I think I'm going to walk through each of the tweets within that thread. I think there's 9 there, and use sort of the quote-unquote positive or negative, right? Like, here's the different experiences I've had. So in dialogue with the staff that are leading the training, that's something they asked me to kind of emphasize. Talk about, in this particular, for example, like when I talk about Chris's oncologists, and there are 2 different approaches. This one felt really closed, this one felt more open and supportive, those kind of things, and glean and highlight what I've learned from those experiences. So I guess the idea is then new staff take my story with them into their daily work.
What an amazing opportunity.
Isn't that awesome?
To start off someone's career with some wisdom and some experience.
That's part of the system change. I think it's like a massive part of the system change.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
I had no idea that was happening.
No?
That's fantastic.
Okay, I thought you knew about this.
No, I didn't
Yeah.
know.
And so now that I'm involved with Patient Voices, I get emails routinely, like, here's opportunities, and the province is broken down into quadrants and has leaders, and people constantly letting you know about different opportunities to engage as a patient in all kinds of different. It was through them actually that too, because I put my name in for the Ministry of Health has a new MAiD oversight committee. So I actually was shortlisted in that competition too. Wasn't successful, but still a really great experience. So yeah, all kinds of. So it seems like it's an organization that's really being heavily engaged by healthcare in terms of bringing the patient and caregiver voice into patient voice predominantly, but into training, committees, etc. A lot of the stuff probably that you're doing.
Yeah.
In terms of meetings.
I feel so grateful that our health ministry had the wisdom to create the BC Patient Safety and Quality Council, right? And within that council, they actually define quality in healthcare. They break it up, the BC Quality Matrix. You guys Google that, because I can't spout it off the top of my head, but it has something to do with is the care that you're receiving, is it acceptable? Is it accessible? Is it appropriate? Is it effective? How was your experience? I can't remember the rest of it, but it's nice to have something that you can actually bring into any system redesign conversation and say, are we actually hitting each of these parts of the quality in the outcomes that we're hoping to develop within this change that we're doing, and having that there. And I know that they are kind of like in the parent organization for Patient Voices.
I was going to say.
Yeah.
That's my understanding.
Yeah, that's why I brought them into the conversation.
Yeah.
And you can follow them at BCPSQC.
Yes.
Yes.
And then Patient Voices BC has its own.
At Patient Voices.
BC.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So some great stuff going on in this province.
We're pretty lucky, and unfortunately most of the direct care staff and patients may not have experienced the benefits yet, but there is lag as things trickle through the system. And I hope that if you're listening out there and you want to become involved, connect with some of these people that we mentioned, and you can be part of the change as well. I really believe that. One of the most fantastic experiences in online learning that I had recently was the School for Change Agents thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're a
so
recent graduate.
I am a recent graduate.
Helen Bevan, right?
Oh man, Helen Bevan is my hero. At Helen Bevan, Bevan. She's out of the UK, and I always get her title wrong, but she's like a super connector, compassionate leader, system change genius, change agent genius. Yeah, she's very well respected and well liked, and that's because she's consistently providing pragmatic, practical information in the form of tweets. She realizes the importance of leveraging social media in generating worldwide change. The fact that I was able to, without any cost to myself, access the information that she's putting out there and interact in a meaningful manner to get the learning that I needed to learn how to be more successful in leading change. That's really impressive. That type of openness, the generosity that her organization, I think it's called Horizons NHS, I think that's the organization that runs it, and it's called School for Change Agents. I can't remember the
tag is shorter, right?
Yeah.
I don't remember what it is.
Anyways, Helen Bevan, that's a great place to start. And Zoe Lord and Catherine Pereira are her two partners in crime for most of the School for Change Agent stuff that she does. Amazing experience. The way that they were able to run webinars and have almost 1,000 people on one webinar,
Really?
but still create a really engaging experience.
Huge number of people
in like 90 minutes. Just a really powerful, potent experience, and the way they were able to speak their passion and inspire in every session consistently. Just another out of this world experience of connection.
So were the
internet.
attendees all healthcare providers?
I don't know.
You know.
I don't know, but a lot of them were, and
Interesting.
I had that really neat experience of, after graduating, like 3 weeks later, being in YVR at Vancouver Airport on my way to India, and the person in the X-ray line, who X-raying baggage, turns around and says, "Lawrence, right?" And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, it's Liz." We'd never met in person before, and Liz Lamb was a graduate of School for Change Agent the year before, but I think she pops into some of the discussions, and she does some things with the Patient Safety and Quality Council and some other stuff.
Awesome.
So
6 degrees of School for Change.
yeah, that's amazing. Really
That's
neat.
really cool.
Yeah, having a lot of these types of experiences. 2 days ago at the Ministry Building, I ran it. I used to be on the undergraduate faculty at UBC Medicine. In there, they have some physician leaders or curriculum heads, like the head of a particular theme in the undergraduate curriculum for the 4-year medical school program.
Okay.
And for the first 2 years, I was a co-lead for the patient safety theme. That was my title, and my co-lead was Malcolm McClure, and Malcolm is like a really experienced researcher in the area of pharmacotherapy, and I hadn't seen him for quite a while, probably almost a year, I feel like, and I was just walking into the Ministry Building, and there he was, and I'd never seen him on Vancouver Island before, and only usually in Vancouver. So having a lot of these serendipitous meetings of just reminders, I feel that maybe this is, these are things that I have to be continued to do, to continue to cross through silos and then make connections and see what happens, right?
For sure.
So on Twitter, in the Twitter sphere, I know that you and Andy DeLeo,
Yeah. I'm saying his name properly.
that's one of one of the really meaningful connections you've made.
For sure.
I value our connection as well. Who are some other follows that you would recommend for people in terms of healthcare stuff?
Well, I was trying to think about that because we've touched on a lot of people already.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
definitely Julie and definitely Maggie are two big people in my world. Somebody we haven't talked about is Victor Montori.
Yeah.
Why We Revolt.
Yeah, he has that
Right?
book, Why We Revolt.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry to admit I haven't read it yet.
Me neither, but I'm thinking about bringing it on the plane because it looks like it has plane potential. It looks like it could be consumed in one flight.
Yes.
So, yeah. So
Yeah.
he's definitely a big follow. So, but yeah, so both of us can't really talk in great depth about that book, not having read it.
But we want him to come to British Columbia,
Yes,
right?
and this is what I was actually thinking before you mentioned who are the names we follow. Who are some people we could bring together to have like a unique... And it would almost be interesting to bring them from different silos. Like, wouldn't it be interesting to bring Victor and Megan Devine from the grief context and... You know what I mean?
Create our
Like,
super Avengers.
yeah,
Our healthcare
exactly,
Avengers.
right? Give them capes. Yeah,
Yeah.
I like that idea. But we do need to bring Victor to BC. He's been to every other Canadian province pretty well.
Where is he based out of again? Which
East Coast,
East Coast?
I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Victor, if I'm wrong on that. But yeah, he's recently in Alberta, right? He's been in Ontario recently. So it's our turn.
I can't remember what specialty Dr. Montori works in.
Me neither.
Okay, doesn't matter. We'll just learn it when he comes
Yeah.
to British Columbia. I think I tried to suggest that the Quality Council actually bring him in, but we'll see what happens. I don't know how that
That's
works.
right, I saw that tweet.
Yeah.
That could be exciting. So people I follow, I'm drawing a blank because I feel like we've talked about like Nat for Docs and
Mhm.
Helen Bevan are two very big voices.
They are.
Do they know each other? Have they ever talked? Can we get them to talk?
I don't know.
That could be exciting.
Whoa, that would be
And
mind-blowing.
Victor? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What a world we live in where we can actually connect with people like this, and
Yep.
yeah, really
Yep.
special.
Clay Forsberg is, I believe he would identify as a patient advocate, but he's somebody who's a really great follow because he's a fabulous thinker, a blogger, and just really tears things apart and asks critical questions. I wonder if he'd consider himself a disruptor.
What's his Twitter handle?
Clay Forsberg, and I think it's just Forsberg.
Okay,
Clay Forsberg. Yeah, he's a great voice.
Mm.
What about you? Can you think of other people that we haven't mentioned? You're wearing the Fight Burnout shirt.
Oh yes, Gabe. Yeah, I can't remember Gabe's handle anymore. Sorry, Gabe, but you're amazing.
I was going to attempt to spell his last name, but it's late at night.
Is it like Charbonneau or something?
Yeah.
Charbonneau?
Chabonneau, I think, without the R. Are we right, Gabe?
Yeah. Fight Burnout. Why do you think most people have any issue with MAiD? Like, what do you imagine to be the main holdups? I know there's that religious one. Like, it's just wrong. You've got to, you can't decide when you die or something like that, right? Is that the religious argument? Probably.
Well, yeah, from a religious perspective, it's suicide, right?
Yes.
So, yeah, you won't go to heaven, I guess, if I can put it that bluntly.
You're not going to go to heaven, and I'm going to allow you to go to heaven by allowing you to suffer longer,
Yeah.
so that you earn heaven.
But in the healthcare context, I mean, one of the things, if we're going to get into controversy, that I didn't realize at all because it was so seamless in our experience was that there's tension between MAiD and palliative care.
Yeah.
My perspective is that MAiD is a part of it, is an end-of-life choice, right? And that, you know, palliative sedation, other options are all end-of-life choices. And I experienced such an integrated, I have to give a big shout out to the Fraser Health New West palliative team, even though I think they're probably a different team now than we worked with them, but they were absolutely phenomenal. Chris was their first MAiD death, and you wouldn't have known that.
Oh, are you serious?
And
Oh,
it's
wow.
really where I began to understand what, obviously, right, because I was thrown into it, the palliative context, and I couldn't agree more with what I'm reading on Twitter in terms of the expansion of palliative training being so critical in terms of integrating into all other forms of healthcare. Comfort, right? You know, if you just take that literal, definitive
Yes.
explanation of what palliative is, that provision of comfort. So there's a tension between MAiD and palliative, and I think that if I were to explain it simplistically, palliative care has a long tradition, right? And I think from what I'm reading from palliative care doctors, a feeling that they're left out of large dialogues, of training, that they're siloed,
Yeah.
So then along comes MAiD, right? And it's very big and loud, and we're talking about it a lot. And I think there is a fear that it will overpower palliative choices, whereas my sense and my experience with it is that it's very integrative. The palliative care my husband received was a huge part of his end of life, in terms of the comfort and for me, it was revolutionary as an advocate. Even before I was using that name for myself, because these people did exactly what I thought healthcare providers should do, which was they gave me their humanity. I sat with Nurse Joanne and we whispered at the dining room table how we were going to deal with my husband because he was really ornery. You know, she cried the last time she saw him because she said, I wanted to be here for your death, but I can't. It's too much for me because you have been my patient.
Wow.
Like we got real people.
That's amazing.
You know, and for me it was like, yes, this is what it's about. This is the N of one, except there were, you know, I was 1 and they were 6. But so I think, you know, there's a point of tension there for sure. I think in general, and I can apply this theory to people, but I can also reduce it a bit, and I've written about this, I've blogged about this, that I think the larger change in healthcare can root from what we're seeing in MAiD, because MAiD is really about an activated patient and a humanized healthcare professional. So when I take Andy's N of 1, that's my expansion of it. That if you have those two concepts together, which we see, assisted death, I think, has the ability to revolutionize healthcare, because if it's done quote unquote well, if it's true in terms of sort of the philosophical beliefs behind it, the patient being able to choose and the healthcare provider stepping out of that quote unquote do no harm model, right? That all-knowing context to allow the same things we've been talking about this evening in terms of giving the patient space to make a choice that might contradict what you feel is quote-unquote best for them, right? There's the revolution right there. So what I would say to expand upon that is that I think probably the most critical aspect there that needs to be delved into is fear, and maybe that relates to compassion and self-awareness and emotional intelligence and all those things that make someone a really good healthcare leader, right? But also make someone a really good patient. And I think patients are having those conversations with themselves and their families when they're debating if they want an assisted death or not. They're actualizing even more deeply in terms of, yeah, this is just, you know, in its incompleteness, this is the right choice for me. Yeah. This is what I want. But that, I believe, has a lot to do with exploring our fears about things. Those things that we avert our gaze from, those things that are maybe triggers for trauma in our life. You know, those things that make us uncomfortable. We've got to go there. We've got to have those conversations and those feelings and put them out there. People are doing that and making the choice. Providers are doing that in making the choice to be MAiD providers. Yeah. Everybody around the periphery of that who's uncomfortable or disagreeing or avoiding all have that potential to have that same kind of conversation.
So it sounds like you're asking for a call to courage, you know, to step into these uncomfortable conversations, to speak about when I help you to die in the way that you choose to, and saying something like that.
Yeah, and you know, and I see the point of tension, like, you know, and I've even looking at like the World Health Organization's definitions of hospice and palliative, and I like tried to pull this apart, like, you know, will not hasten nor prolong, right? Like, do you actually need to change those definitions, or can you just fit assisted death in those definitions somehow? I'm not sure. Sometimes I have moments where I think, yeah, you could totally fit that in there, and other times I think, no, we have to go to the World Health Organization and change the definitions. But I think at the end of the day, we have legislation in this country, and it probably does come down to the personal comfort of the individual. I don't know, how does that resonate with you? Like when you think of the do no harm context, or the hasten or prolong, and because you are hastening someone's death, you can't get around that.
Yeah, so I think it comes down to, how do you define harm, right? I think the definition of harm should be a patient-centered definition.
I was just going to say that.
Yeah, it should be. So
if they don't feel they're being harmed, then it's not harm.
Yeah, and I think what we're dealing with here is, I think we're dealing with a potential crisis of conscience for the healthcare professional. And
For sure.
how do we relieve that conscience? And that, it sounds like that sits in the hands of the patient who's choosing sometimes to relieve that conscience. It may be to say, to step up and say, this is no longer your responsibility. This is my choice.
Yeah.
I'm asking for your help here, and I free you from the consequences of this. This is what I want, and then allowing the healthcare professional to make the choice of whether or not they want to participate, right, and to be helpful in that situation. I think there is that. Often as a health professional, we get caught in those situations where we assess our patients at times without potentially even documenting it anywhere about that patient's capacity to make good decisions, and that is actually part of what we actually do on a regular basis. Is we assess what is the patient's actual life experience and their the capacity to really make the best decision. How much assertiveness do I, as a healthcare professional, need to put into this relationship in order to potentially guide it to where I believe is the best place, best outcome for the patient.
Yuck.
Yeah, that's
sounds
gross. It sounds
Sorry,
gross, eh?
but
unfortunately,
I keep hearing you're talking, and I'm hearing the word judgment. There
is.
There's a judgment involved in that.
That is the culture that we're brought into. That we are trying to judge. We are judging capacity. We're judging life
Can they
experience
make the best decision?
and all. Yeah.
Who cares? They can make a decision.
Yeah. So, and then the physician weighs in the all the other the social factors and the mental health factors that come in there, and the stress, the current stress that the patient is experiencing at the time, and how that weighs in on the decision-making process, and understanding and having the experience that patients have made decisions on day 1, and then on day 3 the decision is different, and then understanding that that's happened historically for a different patient in a similar situation. Will that happen again in this situation? And like, to be able to be a healthcare professional and completely mindful and objective, and to allow the truth that this is a completely different set of conditions, that the past will not predict what will happen in this situation. That is very difficult. That is a challenging situation.
And what comes to mind for me with that is that those are moments when I diverge from the N of 1 concept, and the word patient-centered care, like patient-managed. There's a while there on Twitter where I was all about management, like in terms of and I still say that, like my healthcare belief system, I manage my healthcare. So you are providing me, you could be cold about it and say you're providing me with a service, right? But you're bringing knowledge in that supports my decision making, which is not necessarily the model in which I think healthcare providers are always educated, right? I think it's more along that relationship N of 1 context. But for me, sometimes I've had these like dig my heels in kind of moments where it's like, no, it's just about my managing my health, and you give me information and I make choices. Thank you very much. That might be a little bit cold, and there are obviously people out there who don't perceive their healthcare that way. They want to be told what to do. They're not sure. They're uncomfortable, right? Empowerment might be an overwhelming concept for them. So that comes in, I'm sure, in terms of the judgment, in terms of understanding who the patient is, who's in front of you, and what they want from you, and giving them space to be able to contextualize and ask. And sometimes maybe they don't, because they might be really old school and feel that that's really disrespectful to ask you those questions, right?
And there's an absolutely very wide continuum or spectrum of how much of that, how much of the physician's input that each patient wants. Some patients want, hey, you're the doctor. I've had so many patients say, don't ask me, you're the doctor. Please don't ask me.
How do you feel about that?
That is a horrible situation to be in, because that is a huge responsibility.
Right, yeah.
That is putting me elevating me to a God type, dictator type of situation where I am not comfortable in general.
Yeah.
So I always, even reflexively, continue to ask. And then they keep saying, I've told you, you're the
Ooh,
doctor.
Yeah.
And that happens over and over again, mostly with people who are over 50 or 60
Right.
years old.
Have you ever had the urge to sort of pass them along to a different physician who maybe has that, you know, is that like matching personalities? Do you know what I mean?
I don't know.
Does a patient like that warrant a physician like that, quote unquote?
Oh, interesting. That is such an interesting question. I have never been someone to, I've always offered patients, hey, you know,
Yeah.
please seek out other physicians. Make sure,
Right.
I encourage people to shop around and see which physician fits you the best.
Well, and nowadays you'd be grateful to have a GP, right?
And
so
then-
you're
and
not.
then
It's not
people are-
exactly like
People are trapped. They're
Yeah.
trapped with a GP. They know that if they lose their GP,
Yeah.
they're stuck.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yep, for sure.
Yeah,
So, but in
really
an
tough.
ideal world, right? It's almost like going back to personality types, N of 1 types.
Yeah.
You know, complementary personalities in that N of 1 conversation.
Mhm.
Yeah.
How do we stimulate the ideal N of 1 relationship? Because I agree that is the way that culture shifts in the physician-patient relationship being meaningful. That's all that really
Yeah.
matters. But from a systems perspective, how do we accelerate something like that? How do we make that the priority?
I think some of that's only, I mean, we touched on it in terms of, you say it's older patients who ask you to, I think some of that's just going to come with time.
Yeah.
You know, those people who resist the Google search or, you know, that's, as younger generations get older, it's just going to change I think
Yeah.
that's just the perspective of the patient.
Yeah.
The choice of the patient, the choice model of the patient will just change.
It'll happen naturally.
I think
it's happening already.
It'll just happen, and that's why I say, like, sometimes, you know, we talk about, well, this very question you just asked, like, how do we bring this about? Maybe it's coming about. It will
Yeah.
just come about.
So
because
maybe
we're doing
we
it.
don't need to advocate for it because it'll happen already.
I don't know. Maybe we just need
Our
to get
energy.
busy. Like, it's some of that, yeah, like, you know, stop looking around and just
Yeah.
move your feet kind of thing.
You already
Which is
have
a
what-
hopeful
what-
concept.
Yeah, well, the work
Right?
is done.
Yeah.
Work is done. Now we can go on vacation.
Right now, someone's watching us saying that we're really naive.
Is it possible that some of the resistance to medical assistance in dying comes from that pessimistic viewpoint that physicians who help with that, they don't actually care about you. They're just interested in the funding that they get from helping you die, and
The money that the system saves.
they're going to save the system money.
You know, that came up. I was interviewed for a Vancouver Sun article.
Oh, I missed
and,
it.
that was like early days after Chris died, and I think it was in one of the comments, and I went, "Oh, I never thought of that." And then I said to myself, "But what's so wrong with that? It's a byproduct. It's not a goal, right? Nobody's like, let's, you know, ooh, look at the money we can save." No, but let's talk about it. It's like saying my dead husband. It's a byproduct. Sure, the system saves money, right? And so what we should spend more money and by making people suffer?
So yeah, I think that really scares people. I think
for
I think
sure.
it triggers people because they're like,
There's going to be mass MAiD. There's one of the major fears. There's going to be MAiD everywhere.
well, it's the shift in the culture
For sure.
of trust of the physician, because
Yeah.
if someone wants to live, you do not want to get the cheap option when the expensive option that works better is available.
Of course.
And then so that idea of economics, economic benefit is, like, in Canada at least, we've done our best to try to remove economic benefit.
So if
from
the word
decision.
comes up, then it's almost insulting. Like, oh my God, you
Yeah.
know, that
Yeah,
must be
it's
bad. Whereas, like I said, I went,
scary.
oh, well, isn't that a good thing? You know, sitting, stagnating, suffering in the health care system, not wanting to be alive, costing money,
Yeah.
you know, but I get it.
And being a physician who works in the hospital, we see so many people suffering, and we see that suffering, and we're impacted by that suffering, and we often ask ourselves, what is the point of the suffering? Just like patients themselves ask, what is the point of this suffering? And so then there's on both sides of it, but then the reason we see it all the time is because we feel that somebody else feels there's value, and often it is the family members of the person who is sitting and suffering does not want that person to disappear.
Oh, that's huge. And I mean, I attended a community conversation at New West Hospice Society where that came up in terms of, people's opinions about medical intervention. There was no conversation about MAiD in this, but yeah, I mean, being influenced in terms of your choices by your family members, it's really heavy with me. I mean, it's so active in the MAiD context, right? Like, Chris was really lucky, but he did get phone calls the day before from previous family members from his first wife's family who are very religious, trying to convince him not to.
Yeah,
Texts
wow.
the morning of, his son's phone was dinging away as people were, can you get him on the phone? Thinking, and to me it's like, wow, that's a huge ego that you think that your conversation is actually going to change his mind the morning of. Like, and I'm speaking really critically and judgmentally here, but there's that lack of consciousness in terms of your own fear.
Yes, and
right?
and part of it, some people do things sometimes because they think they can change the outcome, but sometimes some people do it just so they can cover their conscience.
For sure, it's so much about
I tried
it,
to
and
save
again,
their lives.
that's that, like that.
I tried to make him go to heaven.
That personal care, for sure. But the suffering contract, I mean, my God, right? It cracks it open in terms of like societal beliefs, religious beliefs, and then of course another angle, right? In that we can keep you alive. We can keep you alive. Not should we keep you alive. We can keep you alive, right?
Yeah.
So at some point it almost becomes like a science experiment. Look what I can do.
It's almost always like,
and we're not science experiments, Sue Hewson, who's a former board member with Dying with Dignity Canada and former chapter head of the chapter here in Vancouver, is a veterinarian. So there's a logical, connection there in terms of where her beliefs come from, right? I mean, we don't allow our animals to suffer. Like this is a constant conversation in the assisted death community, So why do we allow people to suffer? And where's the love in that?
I think some of the religious families that I've spoken to when their family member is dying, they've said, but miracles can happen, right? And I can never say miracles can happen, right? So as a physician in the case, I would have to say, sure, miracles can happen.
If you believe that,
if you believe that, sure.
Yeah.
And have I seen miracles happen? Maybe. I might not have recognized them as such,
right.
But I've heard of people making miraculous recoveries, and then are we robbing people of their miracles? And that is a question nobody can really answer, right? That is a weird
and
question.
It's so personal, and again it goes back to that. I mean, we've introduced the word suffering, so there's obvious dialogue around that, but our dialogues about death and integrating death, which relates again to that, like, I can keep you alive, part of what the last 100 years, death was more recent, more common, it was a part of our life. We did talk about it because it was there and we had to. That's absent. How do we bring if I could pick one point of advocacy, it probably would be that, in terms of how do we bring this word back in, because the potential for change on a very broad front, I think, is so significant. For individuals to consider, like, what do I want out of my death, right? An advanced care plan. Work on your advanced care plan. I'm putting a plug in for that.
Work on your advanced care plan. And where do they start? If they wanted to start working on an advanced care plan, how do they start?
There's Google advanced care plan. Dying with Dignity has information on it. There's so much out there that you can get. And don't wait until your hair turns gray, because I'm out of luck in that regard. Like, there need to be, when there are information sessions on MAiD that I've attended, it's always older people. And what I would love is to see us begin to have dialogues with younger people about death. With children, to normalize it. because I think it would change those conversations about but you know, there are miracles, right? Well, yeah, sometimes there are miracles, and it's also okay that this person you love is dying.
Yeah.
It's going to hurt, but it's also okay that this is a part of this larger process of life, right?
Do you think that what makes you okay with MAiD, maybe ironically, because we're talking about those religious contexts where there's opposition, is the spiritual understanding that Chris is still around?
Does that make me okay with MAiD?
Does that help you? Because often the time the people the family members who I see who are fighting and advocating to keep a patient potentially in suffering, it's because I don't want to lose them. I don't want them to disappear from existence.
I think it's exploded it, for sure. So for context, in the podcast I did with Death Dialogues with Becky Costello, what's your last name, Becky? One of the things that she talks about is that often when she talks to people about death, she has to really get into the conversation, and then it will kind of sneak out that people have had some kind of an experience with a family member who's died where they have a sense of them tangibly, you know, with like a thing, or energetically or emotionally, and that this is actually really a common thing, but we don't talk about it because people, you know, what did we use in the pot, like the woo woo, you know, or the wacky or quacky, or you know, those sorts of phrases, right? But yeah, for sure. I mean, it's not so much MAiD, it's death and life. I have a different perspective because I do have a sense of Chris quite regularly. And I think, ironically, I have a sense of him because I think he's stuck around energetically because he left so angry, because he had so much discontent in his life, which is really where I come from when I blog. The whole reason I started blogging was this notion of, I call my blog as Bring the Joy, you know, my belief that you die how you live. So if you've lived in discontent, you will die in discontent. So there's a much larger philosophy there. But oh yeah, for sure. I think on that broad scale, his presence, you know, in the little things, like in the tangible things, like songs and some of the things that we might talk about more sentimentally, I view those more tangibly, quote unquote, now in terms of quote unquote communication. You know, a sense of someone telling me something. Yeah, it's exploded my sense of what death is and what death really means, and that it's not necessarily about the termination of a connection to someone. And that, you know, but that gets into really existential conversations about what do you believe about spirit and soul and those types of things too, right? That are very absent from our healthcare dialogues, which, you know, almost wraps back into what I was saying about those personalized conversations in those moments about when you're making decisions, right? I think there's a lot of things we push out to the periphery because, not just because they make us uncomfortable, but you don't want to offend someone, right?
In Fraser Health, I'm always really excited and happy that we do have a spiritual care department kind of thing. Did it, throughout Chris's journey, were you guys ever offered spiritual care?
I want to say no, but it's possible someone did, because, you know, in those moments there's so much going on. We had a social worker who engaged with us. She was really supportive. I met with her more. He was more close to that. The nurses offered so much of that context, for sure. Right? There was so much room for personality. Oh yeah, for sure. So one of my favorite stories, and I blogged about it, was one of the nurses that showed up, and I can't remember her name properly, and I'm not going to say it I'm not going to butcher it. But she showed up, and she was very hands-on, very tactile, and she'd worked in hospice a lot, and she just wanted to look at our tattoos. So she just kind of manipulated us, and she was just overflowing with personality, and talked about her views of death and life, and I think, having come from a hospice context, she'd had the opportunity to engage people with that already, right? And to reflect on that in terms of her own beliefs. But it was just kind of shocking. I remember thinking, do I feel uncomfortable about this, or do I really like that she's like picking my husband's hands up to look at the tattoos on his arms? At the end of the day, I loved it because we got a sense of who she was, right? And we had those kind of conversations.
It sounds like she came in with a an interest and a warm energy and a desire to really know you guys as people.
For sure. I'm glad we're talking about this because I'm going to include this in my patient voices
Love it.
piece for training new nurses.
So often I see busy nurses running around in the hospital trying to avoid eye contact, trying to like potentially avoid interacting with people because they're overloaded and overwhelmed and they've lost the capacity, and potentially the leaders currently on the ward have lost the same capacity and see no value in making those human connections anymore.
And that's the burnout, right?
And that's the burnout, and it's fucking everywhere. And it's so sad, but people are becoming more aware of it. People are talking about it more. I had this really disappointing situation about a month and a half ago. I was doing a quality improvement workshop experience, and I was trying to set the context within which we're trying to do quality improvement, where there is such a high level of burnout. And then afterwards, there were a few colleagues and peers of mine who said, I wish you hadn't made it so depressing. That's what they said. Like, I don't think you need to talk about burnout in this particular context of this lecture. And it felt to me like they said, ignore reality, just talk about the theoretical. Like, that's what it felt to me.
So in other words, you actually did the right thing because you brought discomfort in, which is ultimately good, right? Like, we want to get uncomfortable.
That's the truth. That's the truth of what everybody's experiencing. I actually asked all the people in the room, and there was mixes of quality improvement, healthcare quality improvement consultants. There were nurses, there were physicians, and I said, put up your hand if you think that the majority of your team is burnt out. And like almost everybody put their hand out.
For sure.
And then I said, I tried to get a gauge of what percentage of the teams did they feel were burnt out, and people were saying upwards of 60 and 70%. And I'm like, oh my goodness, the majority. That I was expecting them to say maybe 40, 50%, 70%.
I would have almost wondered higher.
And how are we supposed to expect any quality of care when people have lost their capacity to care? And it's just ridiculous. It just doesn't make any. There's no logic in there at all. And why is nobody really seemingly to do anything coordinated about it? And it's really frustrating in that aspect.
But it makes me wonder, if you opened up the humanity of it, would that help heal the burnout?
I think it would.
Like, because there's an irony in there, because there's almost like an avoidance of the human element because I feel so burnt out. But if you actually looked into that and cracked it open, would that bring some healing?
That is it. But the reason people are avoiding the connection is because of the fear, because no one has shown them how to manage energy, right? How to manage the intake of energy from another person who is suffering.
The human connection.
Just like you said, there's an avoidance of that realness of death, of suffering, because of the fear around it. But if we welcomed and embraced the whole spectrum and continuum of life, then there is nothing to fear. In every situation, it's just a situation, and you see what you can add in terms of value to that interaction, if anything. If not,
which again, it comes back to that shaky oncology foot, in terms of like, maybe there's just sometimes there's nothing, right? Which another concept we haven't talked about is holding space. It was revolutionary for me. Was life-changing after Chris died. In the grief community, I encountered that concept, and I'm going to forget the woman's name who teaches courses around it. You can attend like workshop retreats.
It's an Indian name?
Heather Platt.
Oh, okay, sorry.
It's not an Indian name. I think she's in Edmonton. I want to say she's in Edmonton. So I think she's just at Heather Platt.
Oh, at Heather Platt.
But Google holding space, and it's usually her one article that comes up, and it's talking about someone who's helping a family at end of life, and the idea that, well, who's holding space for I think it's a nurse they're talking about, who's the nurse who's holding space for the family. And to me, it kind of blows. I think it's a revolutionary, critical concept in healthcare, and it's exactly what you're just talking about in terms of, well, maybe there are times where you don't have to do anything, right? You just have to be there, and as human beings, we're uncomfortable with that. right?
Yeah.
We're super
What's my
uncomfortable with
purpose? Would I just go there for nothing?
that. Yeah. And it integrates with death, and you're gonna be fine, you're gonna be okay, it's gonna be okay. Well, no, maybe I'm not gonna be okay. Maybe I'm not gonna be fine, and that's okay.
My reality, my lived reality over the past 9 years being a physician in Surrey has been that is essentially what people come to me for in the clinic, is just for me to be there.
Hold space.
There is so rarely a time. Well,
Interesting.
so rarely a time where a prescription is actually, and something to do is actually there. But most of it is to listen and to reflect, to be a mirror, and to maybe sometimes point just a guide. Would you consider this? Would you consider
kind of like this is happening to me. I'm thinking A, B, and C. What do you think about this?
That's exactly it.
Yeah, I can see that.
So much of my interactions are for that. So I've embraced that it's okay to not do anything, but just to be there. And in that being there, that actually, the value of me actually learning to become present with people in whatever space that they're in, I find it. I have come to believe that is extremely valuable, and the patients respond in kind, and they've been letting me know that it's absolutely very, very valuable.
I can totally see that. And so how do you teach that?
I think it's through vocabulary. I think I'm someone who, I think words are really powerful, and I think words have a lot of meaning.
Like compassion,
empathy, safe space, presence, therapeutic self. Those concepts. When somebody can kind of link it to some other words that they've known before, and building that concept, and having heard those terms, especially medical students, they're really good with learning terms.
They have to learn terms.
So that's going to be part of all my teaching going forward when I work with trainees, and I'm excited about that. These are some of these words I didn't have in my commonly used teaching vocabulary 2 or 3 years ago. So,
awesome. So now you're going to bring in holding space, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Excellent.
Holding space.
I could use that.
I probably have to take Heather Platt. Heather Platt's course in order to do it.
I will send you a link.
But,
I'll send you my favorite. I cannot believe the number of times I bring that article up. I think in our human relationships, it's such a critical. I often bring it up in the alopecia context, because I always joke about grocery store produce conversations. How are you doing? I'm fine. How are you? And then I get to hear all about their chemo experience, which I've never had, right? And my ice cream's melting.
My ice cream's melting.
But just that concept of, and which goes back to, I think, what Refuge in Grief talks about in terms of this grief we're walking around with, that we need to release, right? These stories.
This is Megan Devine, right?
Megan Devine, that we need to release, right? And there's nowhere to go with them. And I think holding space comes in there. Alopecians often get really angry. Well, often they get really angry when you call them alopecians, but they often get really angry in terms of
what do you call them? What's the right term?
People with alopecia. I don't know. Bald people, bold and beautiful. All these titles that get applied to us. But there's perceived judgment in that. But I think it's when you're feeling wounded, right? In terms of you feel like you stick out. You didn't make this choice in terms of losing your hair. The last place that you can really go to, I think, for many people, is to hold space for someone else who just wants to share this story, right? But it's a powerful concept to think about. Maybe you can't necessarily go there, but it's powerful in that, in that moment when my ice cream is melting, this person they under the guise of offering me something, they're actually really asking for something. So there's some human consciousness that comes into play there, right?
I think you've just spouted off a lot of reality, and it brings to mind, I think, what needs to be done about this fight burnout stuff. I think safe space really needs to be held for all human relationships, including the colleagues of mine who work within health and care. And I think that is really one of the keys to elevating the healthcare experience for all people. And it's when healthcare professionals feel that they have safe space and where they can speak about their pains, the energies that they're taking on from the suffering all around them, you know, the constant suffering. We are naturally empathic people, and we will carry much of that energy throughout our lives, and it'll influence our behavior unless we have good energy hygiene. That's what Nat for Docs calls it.
Hey, that's a great phrase.
Oh, I love it. Energy hygiene.
Good energy hygiene. Okay, I might have to take this course.
Oh, you mean the moderator thing?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
See, well, and actually I'm thinking about that as you're talking, because I think one of the questions in my mind is, can patients and caregivers play a role in supporting the reduction of burnout? And what is that role? Or is that more, like when I look at what Nat for Docs is doing with Safe Space Health, I'm like, wow, that's exciting. I think it's my my old caregiving self is like, I want to get in there and help with that, right? Like, you know, that feels natural to me, and that's it. Like, what a profound change to make. And then there's part of me that pulls back and thinks, well, can only healthcare providers help heal healthcare providers?
That's such a good question. Yeah. Wow. That so much of my work in the past few years has with you know, system redesign, especially like in the trying to address the opioid crisis here in British Columbia, trying to get my colleagues, my family physician peers to prescribe stuff like Suboxone in the context of longitudinal primary care. It's been such a shift, and my only successes have been when I've leaned into my and accepted my peer role, my peer change leader role, right? And what the science of change in organizations shows that a peer champion, or someone who leads the change and who is authentic in that leadership and really expounds on the benefits and the risks, and then facilitates great conversations, provides due process around the concerns around the change, are really, those are the peers are actually who make it happen. Those are the influential members of the community. Yeah. And so healing is kind of often done in that same context, where you do have someone who comes to you on a peer level and sits with you in safe space and allows that to happen. I don't know if you need to be a health professional to provide that. I think you just need to be someone who's really leaned into their humanity.
But does it make a difference if it's a healthcare professional? Because there's another layer of understanding in terms of having worked within a system that has deep paternalistic roots, power structures. I mean, the other thing I wonder about too, from a patient perspective, is like, is it triggering in some ways? It's like, oh, sure, I'm going to help this doctor feel better about themselves, but meanwhile, I'm carrying all this baggage from the care I didn't get, right? Maybe there don't need to be lines, right?
I don't know if this is a true statement, but does someone need to be well in order to most maximally assist others in being well?
Ooh.
I don't know.
Good question.
Yeah, I mean, that's one.
Are any of us truly well?
That's a good question too.
Are we fooling
how do we
ourselves?
measure? How do we measure it?
Wellness. Yeah. Does someone need to be honest? Does someone need to be authentic? Does someone need to be open? Yes, those things. Yeah. Yeah. The gifts of imperfection. The Brene Brown moment. Yeah. I think those are probably the critical things. But I do sort of have this feeling like the burnout model is something sort of sacred and internal within healthcare. Could be wrong. I'd like to hear. It would be interesting to ask more patients that, or ask healthcare providers how they would feel about being supported by someone who's a quote unquote trained patient, right? You know, coming from that patient perspective, because it's like flipping the model.
Yeah, I think all the models I think like the beautiful and bald community, the reason that it works and brings value to yourself and to others is because they have lived experience, their peers, right?
Yeah.
And the patient caregiver role, the reason is because we all are caregivers and we've suffered in this way and we've experienced this, and we have some of these shared experiences that I think that shared experience probably is crucial, as you said. Who knows?
I kind of have that feeling. Yeah. Which makes me think about the whole debate around whether or not we are all patients. That's a touchy one, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I identify as a patient as well. I mean, I do have a chronic disease. I take medication for multiple chronic diseases, but I mean, in my burnout experience, I remember doing like 3 years ago when I had the full realization, hey, that was burnout that I was coming through.
Right.
I actually had a slideshow presentation because I'd gone through this course, and I said, I realize now that I went through some of my blood work for the past few years, and there's a measurement called CRP, the C-reactive protein, which is a measure of inflammation within your body. And so if it's high, that potentially bodes unwell for your blood vessels, because inflammation increases disease in blood vessels. And in my case, the source of the manifestation of inflammation within my body was in my joints, my fingers and my toes, completely swollen and really tender and red, and it's psoriatic arthritis. That's what it was. And psoriatic arthritis is similar to rheumatoid arthritis in that it's an autoimmune disease as well, and it flares up related to stress. As you mentioned, you're losing hair at 14 may have been related to significant childhood stress too, right? For me, it was, I think I was mismanaging my energies potentially earlier on, meaning I was taking on a lot of energy from patients, and I wasn't really fully cognizant of it. I wasn't aware of it, and it impacted me, and I was holding it, and I didn't know how to let it go, and it was influencing how I practiced. It was influencing how I prescribed. It was influencing everything in my life, including my autoimmune system. It really flipped and ramped it up, and so I'm on immune suppressants now in order to control that, and I do those regularly. So I identify as someone who, as a patient, I do have appointments I have to go to regularly. I see a rheumatologist, a fantastic one who prescribes the medications and stuff like that, and I've had some care experiences. Thankfully, all of them have been pretty great. So, but
it's an interesting one because I can come at it from both sides. I'm like, of course we're all patients. Of course, you've just described that. That's the experience of a patient. And then I come at it from another angle, like, but we're not all healthcare providers.
Yes.
So you will always have this.
Mutual.
You always have this viewpoint that influences your experience of being a patient because you are a healthcare provider that I don't have. Except that, unless you want to pull it back to the concept of personality, right, or approach. You know, are you more activated as a patient? Well, we're just about to drive by my work. That's my office right there. In case anyone was wondering.
Now you know where. Anyways,
you don't know where we are. But are you by default more activated because you're a healthcare provider, or does that shift when you step into the role of patient? Right? You know, how does my experience in an exam room, how is that influenced by, you know, my personality and my beliefs about being an activated patient, right? So did you find that changed for you? What was it like to be a patient and also a healthcare provider, to be a doctor who was being treated?
Wow. I brought in with me quite a bit of shame because as I walked into the exam room, I had already kind of thought through the causality of how I got to that position, and I realized the self-inflicted nature of some of my inflammation. You know, the way I was eating, the lack of self-care, the
stress management,
and the idealism of that held me rooted in a behavior that allowed me to accept all these energies and not manage them properly, you know. And so I went in there, I was like, I found myself in this helpless position, and also I'm not actually trained in this particular.
I was gonna say, did you Google?
Well, I did Google.
He Googled.
I did Google because I was like, I believe I have dactylitis, and I had been in.
You Googled and you were wrong?
I was right.
Oh,
I was right. So dactylitis is inflammation of your digits related to some type of inflammatory process. And I had not seen a photo of it, since I think Robbins Pathology, which is the textbook that we use in medical school in 2001, and this was back in 20. So it'd been like 16 years since I'd actually seen a photo. I actually never had a patient with dactylitis, like my case.
So dactylitis is the expression.
Is an expression,
Okay.
is one of the potential findings of psoriatic arthritis.
Gotcha.
I also had the enthesopathy, which is the tendon inflammation in the Achilles and everywhere. So that's what made it really hard for me to walk. And I actually went and I had a walker for home. At work, I would just load up with Advil and go to work, and I just worked through the whole thing. I never stopped working throughout the whole situation because there's so many people who I was like, they depend on me. I can't leave work, you know. And there's, anyways. So
Oxygen mask.
Yeah, not smart. So, so I brought in a shame with me into those situations, but I also I have that awareness that the common saying that physicians make the worst patients. And
I haven't heard that one.
Oh, you haven't?
No.
And I
get it.
I think the thing is that they often as well overthink a lot of things and leap to conclusions and like
assume the need for action. I must be able to
either a need for action or become demanding or ask for special exceptions or acceleration of their particular case.
Right, I'm a doctor, therefore.
Yeah. And so being cognizant of that, I decided I don't want any of that. So I just ensured that I was like, I'm a patient, I'm a patient. So I waited. I was in line just like everybody else.
Open to it.
I was open to it, and I embraced that. And I was like, whatever happens, and thankfully everything worked out. And that seems to be the story of my life. So far, yeah.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you found resolution for that in some way.
Yeah, thank you. And it's really challenging. The medication I'm on was initially like $50,000 to $60,000 a year, and that was nightmarish for my family. But we were able to get on pharmacare and then get the deductible and stuff.
Yeah, good. Yeah. Wow.
No insurance would cover me by that time because I already had the diagnosis, and then the Sun Life rejected me and everything. So I was like, I'm gonna have to pay out of pocket, and
we don't think about that in Canada, do we?
I gotta keep working in order to afford it, but I'm having a hard time working, and then anyways.
The cycles.
But got through it. Here I am, and that's why I'm so jazzed. I've been so jazzed since my pain has gone away. My fingers are all back to relatively normal size.
Yeah.
And
I have some small sense of that with this gastritis I've been managing. I just keep thinking about people who live in pain every day. And that changes everything, right?
That is such a big issue. Oh my gosh, running another one. Chronic.
2 red lights.
I'm gonna go to jail after this podcast. So bad. Pain. We don't have enough pain centers. There are no interventional pain specialists who are coming out and opening clinics and getting support to do interventional therapies. And then there's the other pain therapies aside from opioids are all like private pay services generally most of the time. Our health authorities create a pain management service, and then it gets overwhelmed immediately.
And pain has become very political too, right? In the opioid context, but that's that community I'm just getting to know on Twitter is the pain community. People are speaking so specifically from that context, and it is powerful to listen to their perspectives. Yeah, to realize that just how political it is. I also thinking too, you're talking about the autoimmune context. I think what was revolutionary for me in coming into the alopecia community was to have that broader autoimmune context. And just to realize how many autoimmune diseases exist and just what inflammation in the body is all about, and the irony of our ability to extend our lives, yet how we're limiting and decreasing our living, our healthy living by the things that we're doing to our bodies, right? And the things that we're triggering by our choices. Yeah.
It is, it's like literally your body is rejecting itself. Your body is attacking yourself. you're doing it to yourself. It's
And
like that's the message.
How many of us are living with autoimmune disease, right? It's profound.
Eczema, asthma,
MS,
multiple different lung diseases.
arthritis.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that tie-in with, you know, stress, existential crises, you know, things like that all together amplify these things. And just like you said, the causality of disease is never simple and linear. It's always multimodal and
For sure.
Yeah.
And pillars, like those are the other words for me, like not just eliminating cause and cure, but, and I like the word manage, right, which I've referenced, but and this is to credit to Melanie Moyer, who's a big leader, a true leader in the alopecia community. I think she's pulling some of this from someone else, but genetics, environment, diet, mindset, those 4 pillars. I don't know how that relates to, you know, some of the things that you talk about. If you put those 4 things together, if you throw other things,
those are things we talk
in
about all
there,
the time.
you know. But those are things I think we should be commonly talking about, because that to me really reflects the complexity of it, right?
4 pillars again: genetics,
environment, diet, mindset.
Mindset. Yeah.
And then I put in trigger and manage around that. You know, there's things that come into play.
Absolutely.
On top of those, but that it's totally non-linear.
No, that's so much of it. I did a little bit of an observership with Dr. Ali Zentner. She works with patients with who are, you know, challenged with obesity or you know, and she does advice and pharmacotherapy and stuff for obesity, as well as recommends people for bariatric surgery if necessary. And I really liked how she would talk to patients, and one of the things she would say is that, you know, part of what got you here was your genetics, but we don't need to let your genetics be your destiny, you know? And like you have change agency here.
That's beautiful.
You can adjust your diet. And what she mostly works in, even though she's an internal medicine specialist, she works in the mindset area.
I was just thinking about mindset. Because for some people, I mean, that comes back to, you know, personality, and then there's a genetic loop there too, right? And then, you know, we can often, especially now, talk about mindset. It's very it's a hot topic, right? But the notion of you can, and I think it's really profound and powerful to remember that, well, not everyone can. Right? Like, it's easier for some and harder for others, and that mindset is a really complex concept. It's not just this path that you can figure out, right? You know, the importance of it, but also I don't want to say limitations, but the boundaries around it in terms of what each of our individual mindsets are as we come into things. Loops back to the MAiD context, right? You know, no, he didn't die peacefully. You know, he died in discontent, he died angry, and that's just how he dealt with things, right? So there's choice in there, you know, but there's also just that notion of like the mystery of how we think, right? There's the wiring, there's the experience, and then there's something sort of greater than the sum of the parts that comes into play, right? So not controllable, not entirely controllable.
Yeah, and when we start to fool ourselves that it is completely controllable, that's often
when it
where
gets dangerous.
Yeah, it gets dangerous and gets uncomfortable.
And judgment comes into play, and control comes into play.
Yeah. And you're wrong and I'm right comes into play, which is ugly.
Rather than where it just is. And I think that's where MAiD presents some of the most, if you step outside of the Canadian context, I've thought a couple of times in this conversation, I haven't brought it up, but there's a really powerful example, and I believe the young woman was in the Netherlands and she was 17, and so I believe it's interesting to look how different countries use different terminology, right? Euthanasia, assisted suicide. And I think they use the term euthanasia in the Netherlands. So if I get the story right, this young woman had been raped in her teens, and it triggered a profound eating disorder for her. And so based more predominantly on her emotional pain, she applied for and was granted, because they have a much more broad boundary around assisted death or euthanasia in the Netherlands, right? And so she had an assisted death, or was euthanized, or, you know, whatever term you want to pick. But it was quite controversial to read about, right? So you think that, yeah, there's a profound example in terms of, oh, well, but we could have helped her, and did someone use this intervention? And at the end of the day, the limitations of how she saw, or boundaries, again, limitations is a judgmental word, the boundaries of how she saw her life and her experience and her physicality and her pain meant that she just didn't want to live anymore. And she was 17. And age is a huge factor into, that was one of the things that I think I really noticed at the CAMAP conference as they debated the cases at the end. What was the term that they talked about? Not mobility, but something along the line. And it seemed that age always came into play, right? And you could have some of those same factors at play when you're younger, but we seem to expect that because you're young that you will persevere or just push through. So I think this young woman's case is a really profound one in terms of mindset and choice and the value we place on life and all of it. Yeah.
If somebody wanted to look up that article, what would they Google for?
I'd probably just use sort of the common Google search terms. She was 17. She was in the Netherlands. She had euthanasia. She had an eating disorder. That would probably get you to her.
Yeah.
It was in the last 6 months. So, at some point in like late 2018, early 2019. So, but I think it's a really powerful case.
Yeah, it is, because like the majority diagnoses were those who were psychiatric, right?
Yeah, so it was predominantly based on the psychiatric context.
Yeah.
So the mental health context, which in Netherlands and Belgium, I believe, are the only two countries where you're able to apply in that regard. And I think from what I understand, often just the ability to apply means that a much smaller percentage of people actually make the choice for an assisted death in that context. So ironically, it becomes, a soothing. Do have the option becomes soothing and perspective shifts. So that's really interesting to hear. But there are still some people who have pushed through, right? And that's, you're still debating that context here.
Yeah.
Grievous and irremediable. Not really commonly, publicly tangible words to use if you're going to talk about death. What do you mean, grievous and irremediable? It's even hard to say, right? We don't say terminal. We don't say, it's literally grievous and irremediable.
I'm guessing that in cases like that, what we would get a lot of pushback from parents, let's say, of another child like that, and saying, she's just in that mood right now. You can't trust her. That would be kind of the expressions I could see there. And
for sure.
Really challenging.
What could we do to help the eating disorder that might shift how she's seeing the psychological element of it? For sure. But she doesn't want
to wait.
She just doesn't want to be alive.
Yeah.
And maybe it's the hour, but I'll stir in something else that I think really shifted for me in the context of MAiD, is that I have a completely different view of the general concept of suicide. It really relates to this we're talking about. I think it was around the time that Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade died, and you saw a lot of the prevalence of check on the strong ones. I remember being really struck by that, because I thought, well, but they just made a choice. They made a choice. And of course it has profound impact on the people in their lives.
Yeah.
And again, I wonder about the implications of if we talked about death more.
Yeah.
Would that change those choices? Would it change how those of us who are left behind take care of ourselves and perceive death? I don't know, but I really do have a much more simplistic, less judgmental view of it as it just being a choice. An imperfect choice. An imperfect choice.
Like most choices.
Exactly.
Most
right?
choices are.
Exactly.
In the Asian community, talking about death is akin to attracting death to your family.
It's like bad luck.
Yeah, and that's a challenge, right?
Makes sense.
I'm divorced from that, because I was born over here and raised Canadian and grown up in Surrey. I'm okay with talking about death. Like you said, it's a part of life, and it's part of my life. I see it all very regularly. So but that there are some cultural elements that really would keep many cultural people who are of these cultures from supporting that type of culture shift that
for sure. I think one of the most profound conversations, this actually came out of a question that was asked during the community conversation that I attended at New West Hospice Society, was and I think the question related more to decisions, but like life support, decisions about the types of interventions you want at the end of your life. And so the comment that was raised was, well, this can be really offensive to certain people because of not just their religious but their cultural beliefs. And what I thought, because I immediately stepped into the MAiD context, was, ooh, but what if you if you individually feel the desire to go against your cultural beliefs, not just your religious beliefs but your cultural beliefs, how do we create supports for people in that context, right? And that's not just about MAiD, that could be about a lot of things, right? Like to go against, but in that specific example, maybe the question in my mind was, are we going to make assumptions about what someone's choices might be or the respect that we offer them based on culture? Or are we just going to look at them as an individual and give them space to express themselves as an individual? I think it's a really big question.
It is a big question. And if we actually did that, how much suffering would we actually relieve?
Yeah.
And especially in our young people who are between different cultures.
For sure. And then the sad reality that I think sometimes we do make our choices for others and not for ourselves, and that's kind of a personality thing. Chris was very much like that. Having long conversations with an aunt-in-law, an ex-aunt-in-law, and saying, the day before he died, and hanging up and saying, well, she just needs to talk. Giving her the space to do that, right? Wanting to make sure that other people were comfortable. One of his last questions before he died, he was having his IVs set up and he was leaning on me. He's like, did I do everything I should have? Like, are people going to be okay with this? The types of questions, right? Having to reassure him in those moments.
And of course you reassured him.
I did what felt right. Yeah. So some people will always make their choices in deference to others, whereas others will fiercely make their choices in support of what feels right to them. Powerful.
We'd spoken earlier about that that conflict that actually exists sometimes between palliative care and MAiD. And I think I've heard before from some of my palliative care colleagues that we have the ability to reduce suffering. We really have it. We have the technology, the science is there. You're jumping to MAiD without allowing us the chance to relieve your suffering. But in Chris's situation, there was no such ability, no such a service came forward that could actually do that to Chris's need.
And I have really strong perspectives on that, and not just because of Chris, because I find that so incredibly paternalistic. And I get where it's coming from, but to me it's old school medicine, if I might be so blunt.
Like, I can do this.
I walked into a presentation. I'll try to speak about this so that it remains anonymized, because it would probably be really easy to figure out who the person. I walked into a presentation where someone was talking about, it was a palliative doctor, and they were talking about caring for someone, and who said that he was ready to go to hospice. And so the palliative doctor said, okay, well, just give me a couple more days with your meds. And so they were able to figure out a different protocol, and this individual actually ended up not going to hospice and lived a year and a half longer, and was able to see their daughter get married. And so, of course, the energy in the room listening to the presentation was like, hurrah! And I was sitting there seething, because I was thinking, oh, goody for you, pat yourself on your back. He told you he wanted to die. He told you he was ready to let go. And it's imperfect, and it's a choice. It's all the stuff we've just been talking about. So I think there's some palliative doctors totally go there, right? They've totally made that shift. And I think there's still that sort of and I'll use the word, it's this paternalistic palliative perspective of, I know better, I can do this for you. And I think it really loops back into what we were talking about earlier, and that, well, maybe sometimes just don't do anything. You can, but you're there to provide that perspective, and if it's not wanted, it's not wanted. And in your own consciousness of yourself, can you just be okay with that? Can you hold that? I don't know, how does that land?
No, what it's doing for me is really reminding me that when we as physicians, as healthcare professionals, when we think that when we're judging someone as not having capacity to make a proper decision, or not having all the knowledge to make their own decisions about their care, we really have to reflect and try to check ourselves before we wreck ourselves, before we allow ourselves to dictate that this person is acting in ignorance. That we have to ensure that we do communicate in a compassionate, respectful manner what services we can provide, but then after we do that, that we relieve ourselves of that responsibility of death. Yeah.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
That's okay. Yeah, it's awesome that this man got to see his daughter married and stuff. That's great. But he said he was ready to go. And I think it's incredibly disrespectful to not acknowledge that. Yeah. Which is, and I think that's, everything we've been talking about tonight in terms of compassion and empathy and emotional intelligence and leadership. And I think all of those things come into play, in a context just like that. For sure. But it is a massive shift in healthcare, and from what we've been talking about tonight and what you're saying, I think that shift is happening.
Yeah,
it's active.
I think there are definitely going to be more. I see more and more potentially young graduates maybe who are open to that that very patient-centered situation where the provision of death is an act of compassion rather than a violation of a rule set for them, religiously or wherever.
And even just pull it out of death and think about it in the context of burnout, in terms of, if you're educated and you're of the mentality of I have to do everything that I can. I have to at least have presented every option, right? And if you just stand back in the imperfectness of it, what's the implications for burnout? And that I could, and I had that on my plate to present it, but they didn't want it.
Yes.
And so to step back, I didn't have to spin all the plates. I didn't have to turn all the cartwheels. That I'm not as tired as a result, right?
I'm relieved. The patient has taken the decision, and I can now move on to the next patient.
I can let it go and leave it with them and trust them that this is the perfectness of their choice and their life. Perhaps perceived as imperfect by me because I know the parameters that can be expanded for them, but there you go. Yeah. I think we have to be okay with that, or you as physicians are not going to survive, right? And we as patients are going to feel helpless and like we don't have any control over our lives.
Yeah. What's so sad is that at my hospital, at least, I haven't been part of any type of community type of discussion about this at all. I haven't seen it happen at my hospital. I don't know if somebody's actively blocking it or if it's too contentious of an issue to speak about, but I haven't.
So when you say this, what do you mean by this?
Oh, and MAiD, about MAiD.
Oh, about MAiD, okay.
Speaking about it at a rounds where we do have meetings occasionally where there's about at least 30 or 40 physicians coming together for lunch or coming together for whatever, and nobody has spoken about it. I've asked to have some discussion, and at least if somebody wants to make it a debate or something like that,
Maybe that's something I need to step up for, and I mean, I think I've identified right in that context for Patient Voices BC, but
that would be interesting.
But it sounds like there's a hole there that maybe we need to have more of those conversations. I know when I tweeted proudly about leading the Grand Central dialogue, a physician that I don't think is even following me, that I'm not familiar with, commented and said, "Oh, well, I'm taking note, and I'll be bringing the perspective of my patients who have," and he used the full medical term for chronic fatigue. And I kind of went, "Oh, okay," and I didn't reply, but I thought, am I going to be challenged? And in what way am I going to be challenged? And I'm certainly not someone who can speak to that, other than saying you're not usually a candidate for an assisted death if you have chronic fatigue. Sorry, I'm not here to debate that. I'm not. But yeah, so I think touch points, right? Sore spots.
Who would be somebody that you could identify within British Columbia who would be like, yeah, that person would be someone who would.
CAMAP is the resource. The Canadian
CAMAP.
Association of Medical MAiD Assessors and Providers is, I think, an incredible resource. The voices I heard at that conference were just so inspiring in terms of cracking open dialogue. So I think those would be the people to engage with, to have people who are members of CAMAP come in and speak. I think for sure.
And their website, again, do you remember?
I think it's just CAMAP.
It's CANMAP?
CAMAP, yeah.
CANMAP.
And I believe that's their tag on Twitter.
GPS here.
I can
Okay, yes,
guide you
sure.
with that.
You could choose whether or not to use street names. I'll leave that up to you.
I think I can just do a turn right at the next.
Okay. Thank you so much for doing this with
It's been
with
awesome.
me today. I'm so glad. I think it's going to be really long, a really long listen for some of these people, but I think we got out a lot, and maybe
sure.
if we can get some editing, we'll be able to
I was going to
splice it
ask,
up.
are you going to
Yeah.
splice and dice a little?
We'll definitely have to do at least one to make it palatable for others, and then drive that to the full version.
How long have we been talking?
I think about just about 3 hours.
Wow.
Yeah,
When's the last time you had a 3-hour conversation?
it's been a while. It's been a while, for sure. I want to give a shout out to Charlie. I can't remember Charlie's Twitter handle. Is it Charlie?
I think it's just Charlie Moore.
Charlie Moore, right?
Yeah.
CHARLEYMORE. She was there, and we'd gone to the library because I'd been tweeting about wanting to do a podcast, and then you had reminded us, right, to go to the library.
that they have
Vancouver.
sessions on it.
Yeah, I think it's called the Inspiration Lab.
Yeah.
Maybe.
It has podcast booths. Is that
Yeah,
what they call them? Yeah.
yeah.
So you attended a little information session
I
on that?
did. I did. It was fantastic. We were able to get a little bit of a briefing on the software that they use. Like the
Okay.
name escapes me now, but also to see the different rooms they had available. They have one room that can do 8 people at once. In terms of, like, you could bring a band in there, or you could have a big table conversation with 8 different microphones. There's other rooms with about 2 microphones, and there's one or two with just one. And yeah, you can film video at the same time, and then they have video editing stations.
Or you can just put a camera in your car and drive around.
You can do that too, and not edit it at all. Especially the parts where you commit traffic violations.
I didn't see anything.
Do you think I could go to jail for this? Or do you think I can get tickets through a video? I don't know about that.
I don't think
I think I can.
I don't think you'd make it onto their radar. Pardon the pun.
All of a sudden, all the RCMP are watching the podcast. That would be amazing.
But yeah, we definitely need to give a shout out to Charlie. She's
Yeah,
a part of our ongoing off-podcast dialogue.
that's right. Was there anything else that you wanted to shoot out into the world?
Podosphere.
Podosphere? Is that what it's called?
I'm just impressed by everything that we've talked about.
Yeah, it's been good.
Thanks, Lawrence.
Thank you so much. It's been amazing. And thanks for these.
We'll seal it with an apricot.
Apricot.
And I will break open the Smart Sweets.
Oh, so delicious.
Is this okay? I brought one that was ready. I'll only have 1 or 2 of these so you can bring them home to your kids. Or eat them before you kids wake up.
Yeah, that's gonna happen.
Yeah. I've
like
seen your Instagram posts.
They like the full sugar versions too.
Healthy gummies? Those are really good.
So is there really a lot of preparation you think you have to do for Toronto, or not really?
No, I have to do a lot of preparation for Patient Voices BC. I said grievous and irremediable this evening, so there's hope that I'm on target.
If I was to pronounce those words, I would say grievous, and I think you said
Irremediable? Do I have it wrong?
irremediable. That's perfect. Yeah, irremediable. Yeah.
Root word being remedy. There is no remedy.
Yes.
And your pain is grievous.
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 I don't think there's an I
There's
after
it?
the V.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Sounds
grievous.
better with an I.
Kind of does. We should change it.
We
We should
should.
submit to Webster's.
I think I'm thinking of the 90s band, the Grievous Angels, too. That could be it.
Stop recording. Or maybe we should probably do a denouement, some type of closing.
3 top words from our conversation that sit with you as we head on in.
What are the 3 top words? I'm gonna need a moment.
I'll eat a fish while you have your moment.
I will have to say choice. Choice has to be one. Yeah, choice is one. Can you give this the middle one and I'll give the last one maybe?
Leadership.
Choice, leadership. Can we do 4 words?
Sure.
Just for equity.
I'll do compassion.
Oh, you've done it.
Sorry.
Okay.
I took
No,
compassion.
that's fine. I wasn't gonna say that one anyways. I've overused that one. I've hashtagged that one all over. Compassionate leadership is all, like so many of my hashtags, so I'm taking that one. Am I going
Just so you go left.
Left, okay.
Yeah. Sorry, let's just go right on
Alright.
till morning. That's Kingsway for you. Fourth word.
I think it's gotta be, we didn't say it
Choice, leadership,
explicitly,
compassion.
but it's what we're asking of our healthcare professionals. It's got to be humility. I think it's got to be humility. I think
Yeah.
that's the counterpart.
Humanity.
I think that's the counterpart. Yeah, it's what will counter the paternalistic approach. I think.
See, I would explode that and turn it into humanity.
Yeah, very close. Humility, humanity.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Just be human. Just be who you are.
Same root.
Let people. It's the opposite of what probably old school medical training would have been. Let people see who you are. It's why, like, I love the idea of being able to call someone by their first name. Now, that did get challenged. Talking to female physicians, I understand the value of, or someone who might be, you know, if you're younger, or you might be judged.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I learned that from Twitter.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no.
I'm someone who calls everybody by first name, and then yeah, I've started
Totally. So you're going to that lane.
Yep.
It gets tricky around here. And then you have a red light, Lawrence.
Thank you so much. That really helps. I need accountability. This world needs. We got to work in partnership.
Exactly.
One person
we had an
can't
end
follow.
of one red light
We
moment.
can't follow everything.
Now
on
you
our
have a
own.
green light.
Oh, thank you. That's amazing. What would I do without a partner, patient partner?
Driving end of one.
Being so Asian, I hate it. Want to fulfill my identity.
We're using our hashtag words for cheesy late night end of one humor. It reminds me of, I had an archival colleague who had also had a background in English, and so he would take like Shakespeare or other things and rewrite them with archival terms. Not funny. Not funny.
Nerd humor.
Yeah. Isn't downtown New West really pretty at this hour?
It
All the
is.
lights.
12:30 in the a.m.
It
It's
is.
the time to be here.
We have talked for 3 hours.
Yeah, and I know your energy was slightly off because of the stuff that you were mentioning, the gastritis.
It's okay.
And my energy.
You had a full day.
I had a full day, so my energy's off as well. But that's life.
Yeah.
It's imperfect.
All
and
things
it's okay.
considered.
I'm gonna have to say, I want to take back one of humility. I want to say imperfect. We
Yes.
use that one a lot, and I think there's a lot of acceptance that needs to happen there.
Imperfect. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect, and that's okay.
Yep. For sure.
That toxic perfectionism is not getting
No.
anybody any
No.
benefits.
Allow us to be imperfect. So it's left at the next lights.
As we cross over the rainbow.
Exactly. We just crossed over the rainbow.
Yeah.
Which, there's a euphemism for dogs dying that I can't stand. When
Is that what they
animals
say?
die, they say they crossed over the rainbow bridge.
I did not know that.
I really hate that.
Oh,
No, your dog died.
yeah. You hate euphemisms. You're a disruptor
I
of
am.
with
Animal
realism.
humanity.
What?
What is that? It's the fish. It's the fish talking. Late night nonsensical fish humor.
Hopefully you don't have much planned tomorrow. I hope you
Nothing
get to sleep
planned.
in. Oh, good. That is the best.
I even did my vacuuming today.
You're so good.
That ahead of schedule.
It's right here, right?
Yep. Just turned.
I passed this turn like 4 times.
That was pretty funny. I see you, Lawrence.
Yeah, that was awesome. That's good. That's awesome.
Look, and there's people outside of the building. It's a bit of a hub here. Whew! Did we hit stop yet? Better hit stop.
No, we're not gonna hit stop.
No, we're just gonna do some kind of a goodbye. Okay, you have your fish.
Thank you.
Give me my water bottle.
Ah, yes, your water bottle. Thank you so much for
You're
that.
welcome.
I finished it.
Good, and I
needed all
drank
of it.
all of this too. Well, it's a warm day, so.
I brought you a small gift at the door, that book.
Oh.
I know you like to read.
Uh-huh.
This is like a book that was recommended to me by Dr. Don Berwick. He's a pediatrician in the States.
I've heard you talk about him on Twitter. Okay.
Yeah, it's
Cool.
called The Health Gap.
I've heard reference to this book.
Yeah, it's talks a lot of this is when you said you were shifting into general patient advocacy or whatever.
Yeah. This is a
book that will like level you up to health systems challenges and most health systems leaders haven't gotten the
to
wisdom
this
from
place.
this book. So
There's a World Medical Association? I didn't know that.
yeah, he's the president
Huh.
of that.
Or was it the time of writing? When was it written? 2015.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Well, thank you.
Enjoy that.
I will.
But I know you got a lot to do before you read that. It'll be something
And you, what's
good.
does tomorrow hold?
Family time. I don't think we have. Oh, no. I think we moved to Monday. Yeah, we're gonna do a family business meeting because I work with my family on Monday. But Sunday's all open.
Nice.
Yeah, I'll probably sleep in a little bit.
Good. Will the house sleep in, or do you have early risers?
Yeah, we have early risers, but they usually don't interrupt me.
You can work around it. Good.
Yeah,
Good. Excellent.
I'm
Well,
a heavy sleeper.
the light is still on in mine's room or not? She's right up there.
Oh,
So, thanks, Lawrence.
thank
That's
you.
super
Thanks
awesome.
so much. Thank you so much for taking all the time.
For sure. We've been talking about this for a while, so when you said it, I was
Yeah.
like, yes!
Yeah.
Excited.
I took the initiative. I'm gonna come around and give you a hug.
Awesome.
Thanks for getting the. Yeah, that was a long time to be sitting. Thank you so much, Jana. That was an amazing discussion. I know it was really long, and I'm sorry for the audience. Actually, I'm not sorry. You guys got freaking awesome information. I'm going to try to keep the energy up a little bit more next time.